Id Grizzly destroys church service. 7 injured, 2 dead. October 6th, 2024. The morning of October 6th, 2024 dawned crisp and clear across the Missoula Valley with the kind of crystalline autumn air that makes Montana residents feel blessed to call this corner of the Rocky Mountains home. At 6:47 a.m., the sun crested over Mount Sentinel, casting long golden shadows across the Clark Fork River and illuminating the historic spires of downtown Missoula's oldest churches. Among them, St. Mary's Catholic Church stood as it had for over a century, its Gothic Revival architecture a testament to the faith and determination of German immigrants who had built it stone by stone in 1891. Father Michael Joseph Brennan had been awake since 5:30 a.m., as was his custom every Sunday for the past 14 years of his tenure at St. Mary's. At 62 years old, with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a youth spent working his family's ranch near Great Falls, Father Brennan embodied the frontier spirit that had always defined Montana Catholicism. He moved through his morning routine with practiced precision, coffee black and strong, 20 minutes of private prayer in the empty sanctuary, followed by a careful review of his homily notes for the 10 a.m. Mass. The theme of today's service was gratitude and God's providence, drawn from the Gospel of Luke's account of the 10 lepers. Father Brennan had spent considerable time crafting his message around the idea of recognizing blessings, even in times of trial, never imagining how prophetic and tragically ironic those words would prove to be. As he adjusted his vestments in the small sacristy behind the altar, he could hear the familiar sounds of his congregation beginning to arrive. Car doors closing in the gravel parking lot, the creak of the heavy oak doors, the soft murmur of parishioners greeting one another after a week apart. Margaret Rose O'Sullivan arrived at 9:15 a.m. with her usual punctuality, her 84-year-old frame moving with the careful dignity of someone who had attended this same church for 63 years. She had been baptized at St. Mary's as an infant, confirmed at 13, married to her beloved Patrick at 21, and had buried him from this same altar just 18 months ago. Her routine was sacred to her. Third pew from the front on the left side, always the aisle seat so she could genuflect properly despite her arthritic knees. She carried with her the same worn leather prayer book her mother had given her for her first communion, its pages soft as silk from decades of handling. Margaret's great-granddaughter, 7-year-old Emma Grace Mackenzie, bounced beside her with the irrepressible energy that only children seem to possess on cool autumn mornings. Emma's parents, Dr. Sarah Mackenzie and her husband James, a local attorney, had dropped her off for what they called Grandma Great's special church time before heading to their own contemporary service across town. Emma loved these Sunday mornings with Margaret, especially the colored light that streamed through the stained glass windows and painted rainbows across the old wooden pews. The Kowalski family filled most of the fifth row on the right side, a testament to the Polish Catholic traditions that had taken root in Missoula's working-class neighborhoods. Stan Kowalski, a third-generation railroad worker with Montana Rail Link, sat with his wife Diane, a soft-spoken woman who taught second grade at Hawthorne Elementary. Their 4 children ranged in age from 16-year-old Michael, who towered over his father at 6'3" and starred on the Sentinel High School basketball team, down to 4-year-old twin girls, Anna and Sophie, who shared their mother's gentle demeanor and their father's stubborn streak. Near the back of the church, in what locals jokingly called the Protestant section, sat visitors and occasional attendees who weren't quite ready to commit to the front-row intensity of long-time parishioners. Among them was Dr. Rebecca Chen, a wildlife biologist with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, who had moved to Missoula just 6 months earlier to head up the new bear management program. At 34, Dr. Chen had already established herself as one of the leading experts on grizzly bear behavior in the lower 48 states, with a PhD from UC Berkeley and fieldwork experience from Alaska to Yellowstone. She attended St. Mary's sporadically, drawn more by the architecture and the sense of community than by deep religious conviction, though she found a certain peace in the ritual and tradition. What Dr. Chen didn't know, as she flipped through the hymnal and admired the morning light filtering through the rose window above the altar, was that her expertise would be desperately needed in less than 40 minutes. At that very moment, approximately 12 miles northeast of downtown Missoula, a massive male grizzly bear was making his way down from the Rattlesnake National Recreation Area, following ancient migration routes that had been disrupted and fragmented by decades of human development. The bear, later identified by wildlife officials as a 12-year-old male weighing approximately 640 pounds, had been tagged as bear number 394 during a routine monitoring operation 3 years earlier. Born in the remote wilderness of the Bob Marshall ecosystem, he had lived most of his life in the high country, following the seasonal rhythms that had governed grizzly behavior for millennia. Spring meant emerging from his den to forage on winter-killed elk carcasses and emerging vegetation. Summer brought the rich abundance of huckleberries and whitebark pine nuts. Fall was the critical hyperphagia period when bears needed to consume up to 40,000 calories per day to build the fat reserves necessary for winter survival. But this fall was different. Climate change had disrupted the normal patterns of food availability throughout the northern Rockies. The huckleberry crop had failed due to an unprecedented late spring frost, followed by the hottest, driest summer on record. Whitebark pine trees, already devastated by mountain pine beetle infestations, had produced virtually no nuts. Traditional salmon runs that bears depended on had dwindled to almost nothing. Across grizzly habitat, bears were emerging from the mountains earlier and ranging farther than ever before in their desperate search for the calories they needed to survive the coming winter. Bear number 394 had been forced to expand his territory, venturing into areas where grizzlies hadn't been seen in living memory. Wildlife cameras had captured him 3 weeks earlier near the Missoula Country Club, and again 10 days ago, rummaging through garbage containers behind a restaurant on the town's north side. Each venture into human-occupied areas had been more brazen than the last, driven by the relentless biological imperative to find food. As the 10 a.m. Mass began at St. Mary's, bear number 394 was approximately 4 miles away, following the Clark Fork River corridor through Riverside Park. The early morning joggers and dog walkers had no idea they were sharing the trail with 640 pounds of increasingly desperate predator. The bear's massive paws, each the size of a dinner plate, left deep impressions in the soft earth along the riverbank, but the tracks went unnoticed among the hundreds of boot prints and bicycle tire marks that crisscrossed the popular recreation area. Inside the church, Father Brennan began the liturgy with his usual warm welcome, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary's excellent acoustics. "Good morning, friends. What a beautiful day the Lord has made for us to come together in worship and fellowship." The congregation of 93 souls settled into the familiar rhythm of call and response, the ancient words providing comfort and continuity in an uncertain world. Mrs. Eleanor Hartford, the church organist for the past 37 years, began the opening hymn on the century-old pipe organ that was St. Mary's Pride and Joy. The instrument had been built by the prestigious Cassavant Frères Company of Quebec and transported to Missoula by railroad in 1923, a gift from the copper mining fortune of the Clark family. Its rich, resonant tones filled every corner of the sanctuary, from the hand-carved wooden crucifix above the altar to the intricate stone carvings that adorned the church's Gothic arches. The hymn was "Morning Has Broken," a choice that Eleanor had made because she loved the way the melody seemed to dance through the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows. Those windows, installed in 1934, told the story of Christ's life in brilliant blues, deep purples, emerald greens, and golden yellows that had inspired generations of worshippers. The largest window, positioned behind the altar, depicted the resurrection with such artistic skill that it had been featured in architectural magazines and was considered one of the finest examples of ecclesiastical art in the Mountain West. As the congregation sang, their voices blending in harmony that seemed to lift toward the vaulted ceiling, Bear 394 had reached the University of Montana campus. The early morning quiet was broken only by the occasional jogger and the maintenance crews preparing for another week of classes. The bear moved with surprising stealth for such a massive animal, his dark brown fur allowing him to blend into the shadows cast by the mature oak and maple trees that lined the campus walkways. University Security Officer Marcus Williams was completing his routine patrol when he noticed something odd near the university center. At first glance, it looked like someone had left a large dark tarp or sleeping bag on the lawn, but as Marcus drew closer, his blood turned to ice water. He had grown up in Alaska and knew exactly what he was looking at. With trembling fingers, he reached for his radio and whispered, "This is Unit 7. I need immediate backup at the UC. We have a Code Red wildlife situation. Repeat, Code Red." The bear, sensing human presence, lifted his massive head and fixed Marcus with a stare that seemed to see straight through him. For 30 seconds, that felt like 30 minutes, man and beast regarded each other across 50 yards of manicured lawn. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the bear turned and loped away with the deceptive, casual pace that could cover ground faster than any human could run. Marcus's radio crackled with responses from dispatch and other units, but he could barely hear them over the pounding of his own heartbeat. He had seen dozens of black bears during his youth in Anchorage, but this was his first encounter with a grizzly, and the sheer size and presence of the animal left him shaken. "All units, be advised we have a large male grizzly bear on campus. Last seen heading southeast toward the residential area. Contact Fish, Wildlife and Parks immediately." The call went out over emergency frequencies at 9:47 a.m., just as Father Brennan was beginning the first reading from the Book of Kings. Dr. Rebecca Chen's phone, set to silent but programmed to receive emergency wildlife alerts, vibrated insistently in her purse. She tried to ignore it, not wanting to disturb the service, but the persistent buzzing finally forced her to quietly slip the device out and check the screen. "Emergency. Large male grizzly confirmed, downtown Missoula. All available personnel respond immediately." The message was followed by GPS coordinates that placed the bear less than 2 miles from St. Mary's Church. Dr. Chen felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications. She had spent years studying grizzly behavior, and she knew that a bear this far from traditional habitat was likely in a state of desperate hunger, making it extremely unpredictable and potentially dangerous. She quietly gathered her purse and began to slide out of the pew, trying not to draw attention, as Father Brennan continued reading. "Naaman, the army commander of the king of Aram, was highly esteemed and enjoyed his master's favor, because through him the Lord had brought victory to Aram." The irony of the scripture would not be lost on Dr. Chen when she later reflected on the events of that morning, though at the time her thoughts were entirely focused on the crisis developing just blocks away. As she reached the back of the church, Dr. Chen encountered Thomas Riley, the parish's head usher and a retired Missoula County Sheriff's deputy. Tom had noticed her hurried exit and followed, his instincts sharpened by 30 years of law enforcement experience. "Everything all right, Doc?" he whispered, using the nickname he had adopted for her during her previous visits to St. Mary's. "Tom, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Doctor, Chen whispered back, her voice tight with controlled urgency. There's a grizzly bear loose in downtown Missoula. It was last spotted on the university campus, moving this direction. I have to respond immediately, but you need to be aware of the situation. Tom's expression shifted from casual concern to professional alertness in an instant. His hand instinctively moved to his hip, where his service weapon had rested for 3 decades, finding only empty space. How big? He asked, his training automatically cataloguing threat assessment information. Large male, probably 600 plus pounds. Tom, a bear this far into town is either sick, injured, or desperately hungry. Any of those scenarios makes it extremely dangerous. I don't want to panic the congregation, but you need to be prepared for any possibility. Tom nodded grimly, his mind already running through emergency protocols and evacuation procedures that he hoped would never be necessary. Go, he said simply. I'll keep an eye on things here. Dr. Chen slipped out through the heavy oak doors into the crisp October morning, leaving behind the warmth and safety of the sanctuary for the uncertainty of the streets beyond. Her truck, a ruggedized Ford F-250 equipped with specialized wildlife equipment, was parked 3 blocks away near the courthouse. As she hurried through the quiet Sunday morning streets, she could hear the distant sound of sirens beginning to converge from multiple directions. Inside St. Mary's, the service continued, with no indication of the drama unfolding beyond the Gothic stone walls. Father Brennan had moved into his homily, speaking eloquently about gratitude and recognizing God's blessings even in difficult times. His words resonated with the congregation, many of whom had faced their own recent trials, job losses, health scares, the deaths of loved ones, the daily struggles of life in a town where the cost of living seemed to rise faster than wages. How often do we take for granted the simple miracle of gathering together like this? Father Brennan asked, his arms gesturing to encompass the full sanctuary. How often do we forget to be grateful for the roof over our heads, the food on our tables, the safety and security that allows us to come together in peace and worship? In the 3rd row, Margaret O'Sullivan nodded along with the priest's words, her weathered hand resting protectively on her great-granddaughter's small shoulder. Emma was fidgeting slightly, as 7-year-olds do during long sermons, but she was being remarkably good for such a young child. Margaret had promised her ice cream after church if she sat quietly, and Emma was clearly doing her best to earn that reward. The Kowalski family listened with the kind of attention that comes from genuine faith, tested by real-world experience. Stan had been laid off from the railroad twice in the past 5 years, and Diane had taken on additional tutoring work to help make ends meet. Their eldest son, Michael, was hoping for a basketball scholarship to help pay for college, but the competition was fierce and nothing was guaranteed. Despite their struggles, or perhaps because of them, they found comfort in Father Brennan's message about recognizing blessings. At approximately 9:52 a.m., bear number 394 had moved through the university area and was now in the heart of Missoula's historic district. The residential streets were quiet, except for the occasional dog walker or early morning jogger, most of whom were too focused on their own activities to notice the massive shape moving through the shadows between houses. The bear's acute sense of smell was overwhelming him with the concentrated sense of human civilization. Garbage, cooking food, exhaust fumes, and the complex chemical signatures of a city home to 75,000 people. But underlying all those urban scents was something that triggered deep, instinctual responses in the bear's brain. The smell of gathered humans, the kind of concentration of people that in the wild might indicate a large carcass or other significant food source. The scent trail was leading him directly towards St. Mary's Church, where 93 people were creating a sensory beacon that the desperate animal interpreted as potential salvation from starvation. Officer Sarah Martinez of the Missoula Police Department was the first responder to reach the area. Her patrol car racing through the empty Sunday morning streets with lights flashing but no sirens, following protocols designed to avoid creating additional panic or noise that might agitate a dangerous animal. She had been briefed on the situation by dispatch and was coordinating with the Montana Highway Patrol and Fish, Wildlife and Parks officers who were converging on the area from multiple directions. Sarah was a 7-year veteran of the force with extensive training in crisis management, but she had never dealt with a situation involving a large predator in an urban environment. Her standard equipment felt inadequate against 600 pounds of wild animal, and she found herself wishing for the tranquilizer rifles and bear spray that the wildlife officers would be bringing to the scene. As she turned onto the street that housed St. Mary's, Sarah could see the Gothic spires of the church rising above the surrounding buildings. It was then that she spotted movement in the landscaping near the church grounds. A massive dark shape moving with purposeful intent toward the building where dozens of families were gathered for Sunday worship, completely unaware of the danger approaching them. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14, Sarah radioed, her voice carefully controlled despite the adrenaline surge that made her hands shake slightly on the steering wheel. "I have visual contact with the bear. It's approximately 2 blocks from St. Mary's Catholic Church and moving in that direction. The building is currently occupied with what I estimate to be 80 to 100 people attending Sunday services." The response from dispatch was immediate and urgent. "Copy that, Unit 14. Fish and Wildlife ETA is 6 minutes. Do not engage the animal. Focus on civilian protection and evacuation if necessary." Sarah parked her patrol car at what she judged to be a safe distance and grabbed her binoculars to get a better look at the situation. Through the magnified lenses, she could see the bear more clearly, and what she saw made her blood run cold. This was not a confused or disoriented animal wandering through unfamiliar territory. This was a predator, moving with clear intent, following scent trails that were leading him directly toward the church. The bear's behavior displayed all the signs that Dr. Chen would later identify as hyperphagic desperation syndrome, a condition that occurs when bears in their pre-winter feeding frenzy become so focused on finding calories that they override their natural fear of humans and venture into increasingly dangerous situations. The bear's head was low, swinging from side to side as he followed scent trails, and his gait had the focused intensity of an animal that had found something significant. Inside St. Mary's, Father Brennan was building toward the climax of his homily, his voice rising with passion as he spoke about the importance of community and faith in times of trial. "We are not alone in this world," he declared, his words echoing off the stone walls and wooden beams. "We have each other, we have our faith, and we have the protection of this sacred space that has sheltered our community for over a century." As if summoned by some cosmic irony, it was at that exact moment, 9:54 a.m. according to the church's antique clock, that bear number 394 emerged from behind a row of mature pine trees and came into full view of St. Mary's Church. The massive grizzly paused for a moment, as if assessing the Gothic structure before him, then began moving directly toward the building with the determined pace of an animal that had found exactly what it was looking for. The first person to see the bear was 8-year-old Timothy Walsh, who was sitting in the back pew with his grandmother and had been gazing out one of the side windows, bored by the adult conversation happening at the front of the church. At first, Timothy thought he was seeing a very large dog, but as the animal came closer, even his young eyes could distinguish the distinctive shape and size that could only belong to one creature. "Grandma," Timothy whispered urgently, tugging on his grandmother's sleeve. "Grandma, there's a bear outside." Patricia Walsh, 71 years old and partially deaf, initially dismissed her grandson's comment as the kind of imaginative storytelling that children engage in when they're restless. "Shh, Timothy, Father Brennan is talking. But Grandma, there really is a bear. A big one. Look." The urgency in Timothy's voice finally penetrated Patricia's attention, and she turned to look where her grandson was pointing. Through the clear glass of the side window, she could see what appeared to be the largest animal she had ever encountered outside of a zoo, moving across the church lawn with unmistakable intent. For a moment, her mind simply refused to process what her eyes were telling her. Bears didn't come to church. Bears didn't walk across manicured lawns in downtown Missoula on Sunday mornings. But there it was, real and undeniable, growing larger with each passing second as it approached the building where she sat with her beloved grandson and dozens of neighbors and friends. Patricia's mouth opened to call out a warning, but no sound emerged. Her vocal cords seemed frozen with shock and disbelief. Outside, Officer Martinez was frantically trying to coordinate a response while simultaneously watching the developing situation through her binoculars. The bear was now less than 50 yards from the church and showing no signs of changing direction or losing interest. If anything, the animal seemed to be moving with increasing purpose and focus. All units, she radioed. The bear is approaching St. Mary's Church. I need immediate backup for civilian evacuation. This is not a drill. We have a code red situation developing. Dr. Chen's truck screeched around the corner onto the street just as the bear reached the church grounds. She could see Officer Martinez's patrol car and the lone police officer who was clearly trying to figure out how to protect nearly 100 people with limited resources and equipment. Dr. Chen grabbed her emergency kit, which included bear spray, emergency flares, and an air horn, and ran toward Martinez's position. "I'm Dr. Chen, with Fish and Wildlife," she announced breathlessly as she reached the patrol car. "What's the current situation?" Officer Martinez lowered her binoculars and pointed toward the church. Large male grizzly, approximately 50 yards from the building and closing. Nearly 100 people inside for Sunday services. No evacuation yet. I don't think they know what's happening. Dr. Chen raised her own binoculars and studied the bear's behavior. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. "This bear is in hyperphagia," she said grimly. "See how he's moving? Head down, following scent trails, completely focused. He's probably been forced out of his normal habitat by food scarcity. A bear in this condition will take enormous risks to find calories." What does that mean for the people in the church? It means this bear sees that building as a potential food source. The concentration of human scents, the smell of whatever they might have had for breakfast, maybe even communion bread, to a desperate bear, that church represents survival. He's not going to be easily deterred. As if to underscore Dr. Chen's assessment, the bear had reached the church's front steps and was now investigating the heavy oak doors with his sensitive nose. His massive paws, equipped with claws that could rip through solid wood like paper, scraped against the door's surface as he tried to understand this barrier between him and the source of the tantalizing scents that had drawn him here. Inside the sanctuary, Father Brennan had finished his homily and was beginning the prayers of the faithful, the portion of the Mass where the congregation offers petitions for the needs of the community and the world. "For all those who are hungry and in need of sustenance," he intoned, "we pray to the Lord." "Lord, hear our prayer," the congregation responded in unison, their voices creating a harmony that had resonated through this space for generations. It was during this moment of unified prayer that the first scratching sounds reached the interior of the church. At first, the noise was so faint that only those sitting closest to the front doors noticed it. Tom Riley, positioned as head usher near the back of the sanctuary, heard it immediately and felt his blood pressure spike as he remembered Dr. Chen's warning about the grizzly bear in the area. The scratching grew more insistent, accompanied by what sounded like heavy breathing or snuffling just outside the doors. Several parishioners began to look around with confused expressions, trying to identify the source of the unusual sounds. Tom moved quietly toward the front doors, his hand instinctively reaching for the cell phone in his pocket to call for help. But before he could dial, the sounds outside escalated dramatically. The heavy breathing became a low rumble, almost like the idle of a massive diesel engine. The scratching turned to actual clawing, with the sound of wood splintering under enormous pressure. And then came a sound that froze the blood of everyone within hearing distance, the unmistakable roar of an enraged grizzly bear. Father Brennan stopped mid-sentence, his prayer book forgotten as the terrifying sound reverberated through the church. The congregation sat in stunned silence for perhaps 3 seconds, their minds trying to process what they had just heard. Then pandemonium erupted. "Bear!" Tom Riley shouted at the top of his lungs, his law enforcement training overriding any concern about causing panic. Everyone moved to the altar now. The reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. 93 people tried to move in dozens of different directions simultaneously. Children began crying. Elderly parishioners struggled to stand quickly on arthritic joints. Parents grabbed for their children while looking desperately for escape routes that didn't seem to exist. Margaret O'Sullivan's first instinct was to protect her great-granddaughter, scooping 7-year-old Emma into her arms despite the pain in her back and knees. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered into the child's ear, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Emma clung to her great-grandmother with the desperate strength that only terrified children possess. The Kowalski family found themselves trapped in the middle of the sanctuary, too far from any exit to make a run for it. Stan instinctively moved to shield his wife and children, his railroad worker's strength and reflexes taking over as he tried to create a protective barrier with his own body. Diane gathered the twin girls while 16-year-old Michael, his basketball player's height giving him a view over the crowd, tried to assess their options. "Dad! The side doors," Michael called out, pointing toward the smaller exits near the altar. But even as he spoke, they could all hear that the sounds outside weren't limited to the front of the church. The scratching and rumbling seemed to be moving, as if the bear was circling the building, investigating all possible entry points. Outside, Dr. Chen and Officer Martinez watched in horror as bear number 394 displayed problem-solving intelligence that was both impressive and terrifying. After spending several minutes investigating the front doors and finding them secured, the bear began a systematic exploration of the church's perimeter, testing every potential entry point with the methodical thoroughness of a professional burglar. "He's looking for a way in, Doctor," Chen said, her voice tight with professional assessment and personal fear. "This is not random behavior. This bear has decided that building contains something he needs, and he's not going to give up easily. The Gothic architecture that made St. Mary's so beautiful also made it particularly vulnerable to a determined grizzly. The large stained glass windows, positioned low enough to allow natural light to illuminate the sanctuary, were designed for inspiration, not security. The colored glass, some of it over 90 years old, was held in place by lead channels that had grown brittle with age. Bear number 394 had discovered the windows and was now investigating them with growing interest. His acute sense of smell told him that the concentrated human scents were strongest here, and his intelligence told him that these colorful barriers might be more yielding than the solid wood doors he had encountered elsewhere. Inside the church, Tom Riley was trying to maintain order while simultaneously calling 911 on his cell phone. The call connected immediately, but the dispatcher's first question revealed the complexity of the situation they were facing. 911, what's your emergency? This is St. Mary's Catholic Church on North Patty Street. We have a grizzly bear trying to get into the building. There are nearly 100 people trapped inside, including children and elderly parishioners. Sir, I need you to stay calm. We have officers already responding to the bear situation. Are you in immediate danger? As if in answer to the dispatcher's question, a tremendous crash echoed through the sanctuary, followed by the musical tinkling of falling glass. One of the smaller side windows had given way under the bear's investigation, and colored glass fragments scattered across the wooden floor like brilliant confetti. The crash triggered a fresh wave of panic among the congregation. Several people screamed, others began pushing toward the altar, seeking the illusory safety of distance from the breach. Father Brennan, his face pale but his voice steady, began calling for calm. "Everyone, please stay together," he called out, his priest's training in crisis counseling helping him maintain composure. "We need to move as a group toward the altar. Stay calm and help each other." But staying calm was becoming increasingly difficult as the sounds from outside grew more violent and determined. The bear had discovered that the window could be breached, and he was now working systematically to enlarge the opening. Each impact of his massive paws sent more glass cascading to the floor, and with each crash, the barrier between the terrified congregation and 640 pounds of desperate predator grew smaller. Dr. Chen and Officer Martinez had been joined by 2 more patrol units and a Montana Highway Patrol officer, but their resources remained woefully inadequate for the situation they were facing. Standard police equipment was designed for human threats, not apex predators, and the wildlife officers with proper tranquilizer equipment were still several minutes away. "We need to get those people out of there," Martinez said, watching the bear's methodical destruction of the window. "If he gets inside..." "If we try to evacuate now, we could trigger a stampede," Dr. Chen replied. "Nearly 100 people trying to get out of that building at once, with a grizzly bear in the immediate area. People will be trampled. We need the tranquilizer team here before we can risk moving civilians. How long do we have?" Dr. Chen watched the bear's progress with professional assessment. "At the rate he's working, maybe 10 minutes before that window is large enough for him to get through, maybe less." Inside St. Mary's, the congregation had managed to consolidate near the altar, as far from the compromised window as the sanctuary would allow. The distance provided some psychological comfort, but everyone could see that if the bear made it inside, the Gothic architecture that normally inspired thoughts of heaven would become a trap with limited escape routes. Margaret O'Sullivan had found a seat in the front pew, her great-granddaughter Emma still clutched tightly in her arms. The little girl had stopped crying, but was trembling with fear, her face buried against Margaret's shoulder. "Grandma, great," she whispered. "I'm scared." "I know, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her own terror, "but we're going to be okay. Father Brennan is here, and all these people who love you are here, and we're all going to take care of each other." The Kowalski family had positioned themselves in the second row, with Stan and Michael forming a protective screen around Diane and the twins. Stan's mind was racing through possibilities, his practical railroad experience making him assess structural integrity and escape routes with professional thoroughness. The church had 3 exits: the main doors at the back, which were closest to the bear, the side doors near the altar, which opened onto a small garden area, and the sacristy door behind the altar, which led to the priest's preparation areas and eventually to a rear exit. "If we have to run," Stan whispered to his family, "we go for the sacristy. It's the farthest from the bear and gives us the most options." 16-year-old Michael nodded grimly, his height and athletic build making him feel responsible for helping protect not just his family, but some of the smaller children and elderly parishioners who might need assistance. His basketball training had taught him to stay calm under pressure and think several plays ahead, skills that seemed relevant to their current crisis. The sound of splintering wood joined the crash of falling glass as Bear 394 expanded his assault on the church's defenses. The window frame, constructed of solid oak over a century ago, was beginning to give way under the repeated impacts of paws that could decapitate an elk with a single swipe. Each crash sent shockwaves through the building structure and through the hearts of the people huddled inside. Father Brennan had moved to the center of the altar area, his vestments making him clearly visible to the entire congregation. His face was pale but composed, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had comforted people through their worst moments for nearly 4 decades of ministry. "My friends," he said, his words carrying clearly through the Gothic acoustics, "I want everyone to stay together and stay calm. I know this is frightening, but we are not alone. We have trained professionals outside who are working to keep us safe. Our job is to stay together and help each other." As he spoke, Father Brennan was quietly calculating their options and resources. The church had emergency protocols for fire and medical situations, but nothing in his seminary training or decades of parish work had prepared him for protecting his congregation from a wild predator. Still, his pastoral instincts told him that maintaining calm and unity was their best chance for survival. The crash of glass and wood was getting louder and more frequent. Through the damaged window, they could now see glimpses of dark brown fur and occasionally catch sight of the bear's massive head as he worked to enlarge the opening. The animal's focus was absolute and terrifying. This was not a confused or frightened creature, but a predator that had identified a target and would not be deterred. Outside, reinforcements were finally beginning to arrive. A fish, wildlife and parks truck had pulled up, and Dr. Chen felt a surge of relief as she saw officers emerging with tranquilizer rifles and other specialized equipment. But even as help arrived, she could see that they might be running out of time. "How long for the tranquilizer to take effect?" Officer Martinez asked, as the wildlife officers began preparing their equipment. "On a bear this size?" "Probably 8 to 12 minutes from dart impact to full sedation," replied Officer Jake Thompson, a veteran wildlife officer who had been dealing with problem bears for over 15 years. "And that's if we get a good shot placement on the first try." "The window's almost breached, Doctor," Chen reported, watching the bear's progress through binoculars. "We may not have 12 minutes. Officer Thompson raised his tranquilizer rifle and began looking for a clear shot, but the bear's position near the building made it difficult to get the proper angle. "I need him to move away from the church. If the dart doesn't drop him immediately, a wounded grizzly near that many people..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. Inside St. Mary's, the situation was reaching a critical point. The window opening was now large enough for the bear's head and shoulders, and it was clear that complete breach was imminent. The congregation could hear the animal's heavy breathing and occasional growls as he worked, sounds that seemed to come from prehistoric nightmares. Tom Riley, still maintaining his position as unofficial security coordinator, was trying to balance multiple urgent priorities. He needed to keep the congregation calm and organized, while simultaneously coordinating with the emergency responders outside and preparing for the possibility that they might need to evacuate quickly if the situation deteriorated further. "Father," he called quietly to Brennan, "we need to be ready to move everyone to the sacristy if that bear gets through. It's our best defensive position." Father Brennan nodded, understanding the tactical assessment. The sacristy was a smaller, more defensible space with a separate exit, and it would put additional barriers between the congregation and any threat. But moving nearly 100 people, many of them elderly or very young, through the narrow door would take time they might not have. It was at 10:07 a.m., that bear number 394 finally achieved his objective. With a tremendous crash that shook the entire building, the last of the window frame gave way, and the massive grizzly bear thrust his head and shoulders through the opening into St. Mary's Sanctuary. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, predator and prey regarded each other across the sacred space that had been violated by raw, primal fear. The bear's head was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the largest dog any of them had ever seen. His small, dark eyes reflected an intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly focused. His black nose, sensitive enough to detect scents from miles away, flared as he processed the concentrated smells of human fear, sweat, and the lingering aromas of breakfast foods that clung to clothing and skin. The first scream came from one of the Kowalski twins, a high-pitched sound of pure terror that seemed to break the spell, holding everyone motionless. Then the sanctuary erupted into chaos as 93 people tried simultaneously to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the apex predator that had invaded their sanctuary. "Move! Everyone move!" Tom Riley shouted, his law enforcement training kicking in as he tried to direct the evacuation toward the sacristy. But the narrow doorway quickly became a bottleneck as people pushed and shoved in their desperation to escape. Margaret O'Sullivan found herself caught in the crush of people, still carrying Emma, her arthritic knees threatening to buckle under the combined weight and the pressure of the crowd. "Please," she called out, "I have a child!" 16-year-old Michael Kowalski heard her plea and immediately pushed through the crowd to help. His basketball skills served him well as he created space and provided support, helping Margaret maintain her footing while protecting Emma from being separated or trampled. "This way, ma'am," Michael said, his young voice steady despite the terror of the situation. "I've got you." The bear, meanwhile, was struggling to get his massive frame through the window opening that had seemed so promising. His head and shoulders were inside, but his bulk was proving too great for the space he had created. This only served to increase his frustration and determination, leading to more violent thrashing that sent additional debris flying through the sanctuary. Father Brennan, seeing his congregation in mortal danger, made a decision that would be debated and honored for years to come. Instead of fleeing toward the sacristy with everyone else, he moved toward the altar, placing himself between the bear and his people. His voice rose above the chaos, not in panic, but in prayer. "The Lord is my shepherd," he began, his voice carrying with surprising strength. "I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." Some might have called it foolish. Others would later describe it as the most courageous act they had ever witnessed. But for many of the parishioners fighting their way toward the sacristy, Father Brennan's steady voice reciting the 23rd Psalm provided an anchor of calm in the midst of absolute terror. Outside, the wildlife officers had heard the screams and sounds of destruction coming from inside the church. Officer Thompson abandoned his attempts to get a clear tranquilizer shot and instead grabbed a high-powered air horn, hoping to create enough noise and distraction to drive the bear away from the building. The blast of the air horn, designed to be heard over heavy machinery at construction sites, was deafeningly loud even outside the church. Inside the sanctuary, the sound was overwhelming, causing both the bear and the fleeing congregation to pause momentarily in their actions. Bear number 394, his acute hearing assaulted by the artificial sound, pulled back from the window opening and shook his massive head in confusion and irritation. This gave Officer Thompson the opening he needed. The tranquilizer dart struck the bear in the shoulder, delivering its payload of sedative drugs with a barely audible thump. But a wounded and confused grizzly bear was in many ways more dangerous than a purposeful one. Instead of being deterred by the dart, bear number 394's response was to become more aggressive and unpredictable. The sedatives would take time to work, and until then, the bear's pain and confusion only amplified his desperation. With a roar that seemed to shake the century-old stones of the church foundation, the bear renewed his assault on the window. But this time, instead of trying to squeeze through the opening, he began systematically destroying the entire window wall, his powerful claws and enormous strength turning Gothic architecture into kindling. Inside the sacristy, nearly 80 people were crammed into a space designed for perhaps a dozen. The air was thick with fear, sweat, and whispered prayers. Margaret O'Sullivan found herself pressed against the wall, Emma still in her arms, surrounded by neighbors and fellow parishioners who had shared joys and sorrows with her for decades. "Is everyone here?" someone whispered. "Is everyone accounted for?" The question triggered a moment of horrifying realization. In the chaos of the evacuation, several people had become separated from the main group. Tom Riley was still somewhere in the main sanctuary, trying to help coordinate the evacuation. Father Brennan had last been seen near the altar, and Mrs. Eleanor Hartford, the elderly organist, had not been seen at all since the bear first broke through. "We have to go back," 16-year-old Michael Kowalski said, his young face set with determination. "We can't leave people behind." "No," his father Stan replied firmly, his hand on his son's shoulder. "You stay here with your mother and sisters. If someone's going back, it should be me." But before anyone could move toward the sacristy door, the sound from the main sanctuary changed dramatically. The crashing and roaring stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Dr. Chen, monitoring the situation from outside through her binoculars, saw the moment when the tranquilizer began to take effect. Bear number 394's movements became less coordinated, his massive head beginning to sway slightly as the sedatives entered his bloodstream. But he was still conscious, still dangerous, and still inside the church building where people's lives hung in the balance. "How long until he's down?" Officer Martinez asked tensely. "Could be anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes, Dr. Chen replied. "A bear this size, this agitated, could fight the drugs for a while." Inside the sanctuary, an eerie quiet had fallen. Father Brennan, still standing near the altar, could see the bear's massive form silhouetted against the destroyed window. The animal was moving more slowly now, but he was still very much conscious and aware. The priest continued his recitation of the psalm, his voice steady and clear. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." It was then that they heard Mrs. Hartford. The elderly organist, who everyone had feared might be trapped or worse, was still at her beloved pipe organ. But instead of fleeing, she had made a decision that demonstrated either remarkable courage or complete loss of touch with reality. She was playing. The music that filled the sanctuary was not a hymn or a traditional piece, but rather a thunderous, discordant cascade of notes that seemed to shake the building's very foundations. Mrs. Hartford was using the full power of the century-old Cassavant organ, pulling out every stop and playing with an intensity that transformed the sacred instrument into something approaching a weapon of sound. The effect on bear number 394 was immediate and dramatic. The massive predator, already disoriented by the tranquilizer drugs, reacted to the overwhelming auditory assault by rearing up on his hind legs and roaring in confusion and rage. But the drugs were taking hold, and his movements were becoming increasingly unsteady. "Eleanor!" Father Brennan called out, his voice barely audible over the organ's thunderous voice. "Eleanor, you need to get out of there!" But Mrs. Hartford, her arthritis-gnarled fingers still dancing across the keys with surprising agility, seemed determined to continue her musical battle with the intruder who had violated her sacred space. The organ had been her companion for 37 years, and she was not about to abandon it now. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was actually only minutes. The bear, confused by the drugs and overwhelmed by the sound, began to sway more noticeably. His roars became less frequent and less powerful, but he was still standing, still dangerous, and still inside the church with at least 3 people who had not made it to the relative safety of the sacristy. Outside, reinforcements continued to arrive. The Missoula Fire Department had responded with their rescue equipment, and paramedics were standing by for what everyone hoped would not be needed, but feared was inevitable. The street in front of St. Mary's had been cordoned off, and curious onlookers were beginning to gather despite police efforts to maintain a safe perimeter. News crews were also beginning to arrive, drawn by the scanner traffic and the growing emergency response. Within minutes, cell phone videos of the police perimeter and emergency vehicles would be uploaded to social media, spreading the news of the attack far beyond Missoula. The hashtag Grizzly Church would begin trending on Twitter within the hour. But for the people inside St. Mary's, social media and news coverage were irrelevant concerns. Their entire world had shrunk to the immediate question of survival, to the hope that the drugs coursing through the Bears' system would take effect before anyone was seriously hurt or killed. At 10:14 a.m., 7 minutes after the bear first breached the sanctuary, bear number 394 finally succumbed to the tranquilizer. The massive animal swayed once more, took a step backward, and then collapsed with a thunderous crash that sent vibrations through the entire building. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Mrs. Hartford's fingers stopped their frantic dance across the organ keys. Father Brennan ceased his recitation of the psalm. In the sacristy, 80 people held their breath and waited to see if the nightmare was truly over. Dr. Chen was the first to confirm what everyone hoped. "The bear is down," she announced over the radio. "I repeat, the bear is down and appears to be fully sedated." But even with the bear unconscious, the building was still not safe for civilians. The structural damage from the bear's assault needed to be assessed, and there were protocols that had to be followed before people could be moved. The wildlife officers needed to secure the animal and ensure it was properly sedated, and the police needed to clear safe evacuation routes. Tom Riley, who had spent the bear's final minutes pressed against a pillar near the main doors, was the first to emerge from hiding. His legs shook as he approached the massive unconscious form, his law enforcement training warring with his natural human instincts that screamed at him to stay as far away as possible from the apex predator. "Father Brennan," he called out. "Eleanor, are you both okay?" "We're here, Tom," Father Brennan replied, his voice hoarse from the strain of the past few minutes. "We're both unharmed, thanks be to God." Mrs. Hartford, finally leaving her organ bench, walked toward the altar on unsteady legs. The adrenaline that had carried her through her musical battle was beginning to ebb, leaving her feeling every one of her 74 years. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "It's over," Tom replied, though he continued to watch the bear's massive form for any sign of movement. "But we need to get everyone out of here safely." The evacuation of the sacristy took nearly 20 minutes, as emergency personnel carefully guided each person out through the side doors and away from the unconscious bear. Paramedics checked everyone for injuries, finding mostly minor cuts from flying glass and the predictable bumps and bruises that result from 80 people trying to fit into a space designed for 12. Margaret O'Sullivan emerged carrying Emma, both of them shaken but physically unharmed. The little girl's face was streaked with tears, but she had stopped crying and was looking around with the kind of wide-eyed fascination that children often display after experiencing something completely outside their normal world. "Grandma, great," Emma whispered. "Was that really a bear?" "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her voice still not quite steady. "That was really a bear. But it's sleeping now, and we're all safe." The Kowalski family emerged as a unit. with Stan and Diane carefully shepherding their 4 children while Michael continued to help other parishioners who needed assistance. The family's deep faith and Stan's practical nature had helped them maintain their composure throughout the crisis, but the strain was evident on all their faces. "Are we still going to have church?" 4-year-old Sophie Kowalski asked her mother, displaying the kind of logical thinking that adults often find both endearing and heartbreaking. "Not today, sweetheart," Diane replied gently, "but we'll have church again soon. God understands." Father Brennan was among the last to leave the sanctuary, his pastoral instincts making him reluctant to abandon his post until every member of his congregation was safe. As he walked past the unconscious bear, he paused for a moment in contemplation. This massive creature, which had terrorized his people and destroyed his church, was also one of God's creations, driven by hunger and desperation into an act that went against its own nature. "Lord," he whispered, "grant peace to all your creatures, great and small." The aftermath of the attack began immediately, even before all the parishioners had been evacuated from the building. Dr. Chen and her team worked quickly to assess bear number 394's condition and prepare for his removal from the church. The bear was alive and appeared uninjured except for some minor cuts from the broken glass, but the massive animal would need to be transported to a secure facility for monitoring and eventual relocation. The logistics of removing a 640-pound unconscious grizzly bear from inside a historic church proved to be complex and challenging. A specialized wildlife transport vehicle was called in, along with a crane truck and a team of experienced animal handlers. The process would take several hours and require careful coordination to avoid further damage to the church building. Meanwhile, the human victims of the attack were being processed by emergency personnel and victim services coordinators. While no one had been seriously injured by the bear itself, several parishioners had suffered minor injuries during the panic evacuation. More significantly, nearly everyone present would require some form of trauma counseling to deal with the psychological impact of their experience. Margaret O'Sullivan and Emma were among those transported to St. Patrick Hospital for evaluation, not because of any physical injuries, but because medical personnel wanted to ensure that the stress of the incident hadn't exacerbated Margaret's existing heart condition or caused any hidden trauma to young Emma. In the hospital's family consultation room, a child psychologist named Dr. Jennifer Martinez sat with Emma and Margaret, gently asking questions designed to assess the little girl's emotional state and help her process what she had experienced. "Emma," Dr. Martinez asked softly, "can you tell me about what happened at church today?" Emma looked up from the coloring book she had been given, her 7-year-old face serious and thoughtful. "A big bear came to church," she said matter-of-factly. "He was hungry, but there wasn't any food for him there. So Mrs. Hartford played really loud music to make him go to sleep." The simple clarity of the child's understanding brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Children had a remarkable ability to distill complex and traumatic experiences into basic truths that adults often struggle to articulate. The bear had been hungry. The church didn't have what he needed. The loud music had helped resolve the situation. For Emma, it was already becoming a story with a beginning, middle, and end, rather than an ongoing source of trauma. But for the adults who had experienced the attack, the processing would be much more complex and challenging. The Kowalski family, despite their strong faith and practical nature, found themselves struggling with questions that went to the heart of their beliefs about safety, security, and divine protection. "How do we explain this to the children?" Diane asked her husband as they sat in their living room that afternoon, all 4 kids finally settled down for naps or quiet time. "How do we help them understand that church is still a safe place when something like this happened?" Stan, His railroad worker's hands, still slightly shaky from the morning's adrenaline, struggled for an answer that would satisfy both his wife's need for reassurance and his own need to make sense of what they had experienced. "I think we tell them the truth," he said finally, "that sometimes wild animals get confused and end up in places where they don't belong. That the people whose job it is to help animals did their job and helped this one, and that all of us took care of each other just like we're supposed to do." Father Brennan, meanwhile, was dealing with his own complex mix of emotions as he surveyed the damage to his beloved church. The sanctuary that had been the center of community worship for over a century would require extensive repairs. The stained glass window that bear number 394 had destroyed was irreplaceable. The original artisans who had created it were long dead, and the techniques and materials they had used were no longer available. But beyond the physical damage was the deeper question of how to help his congregation heal from the trauma they had shared. Some would undoubtedly be reluctant to return to the building where they had experienced such terror. Others might question their faith, wondering how God could have allowed such a thing to happen in his house. Father Brennan knew that his role in the coming weeks and months would be as much about spiritual healing as about raising funds for repairs. The media attention began almost immediately and quickly grew beyond anything Missoula had ever experienced. Major news networks descended on the small Montana city, drawn by the compelling story of a grizzly bear attacking a church during Sunday services. The combination of religious imagery, wildlife drama, and human interest made it a perfect story for the modern news cycle. Camera crews stationed themselves outside St. Mary's, capturing footage of the damaged building and interviewing anyone willing to speak about their experience. Social media exploded with commentary, memes, and theological debates about the meaning and significance of the attack. Conspiracy theorists suggested everything from government cover-ups to divine judgment, while wildlife advocates used the incident to highlight the ongoing conflicts between human development and animal habitat. Dr. Rebecca Chen found herself thrust into the spotlight as the primary expert witness to the attack. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests from news outlets, wildlife documentaries, and academic researchers who wanted to understand how such an unprecedented incident had occurred. She agreed to speak publicly, hoping to use the attention to educate people about the realities of wildlife management in a changing climate. This incident represents the intersection of several converging factors, she explained during a press conference held outside the Missoula County Courthouse. Climate change has disrupted traditional food sources for grizzly bears throughout the region. Human development has fragmented wildlife corridors, and this particular bear was in the hyperphagia phase of his annual cycle, desperately seeking the calories he needed to survive winter. She paused, looking directly into the cameras. What happened at St. Mary's was traumatic and unprecedented, but it was not random. This bear didn't attack the church out of malice or aggression. He was driven by the most basic biological imperative, the need to find food. Understanding that doesn't make what happened any less serious, but it does help us develop better strategies for preventing similar incidents in the future. The questions from reporters revealed the public's fascination with various aspects of the story. Why had the bear chosen the church specifically? How had he made it so far into the city without being detected earlier? What would happen to the bear now? And perhaps, most importantly, could something like this happen again? Dr. Chen addressed each question with professional thoroughness, but she could see in the reporters' faces that many of them were more interested in sensational sound bites than in serious discussion of wildlife management issues. The story was already being shaped by media narratives that emphasized drama and danger over the complex realities of human-wildlife conflict. Bear number 394, meanwhile, was recovering from his sedation at a secure wildlife facility outside of Missoula. The massive grizzly had suffered no serious injuries from his encounter with the church, but wildlife officials faced difficult decisions about his future. Bears that lose their natural fear of humans and venture into populated areas pose ongoing risks that cannot be ignored. Relocation is always our preferred option, explained Jake Thompson, the wildlife officer who had successfully tranquilized the bear. But this animal demonstrated problem-solving intelligence and persistence that makes him particularly dangerous. He didn't just wander into town accidentally. He systematically broke into a building full of people. That level of determined behavior is very concerning. The options were limited and troubling. Relocation to a more remote area was possible, but bears have excellent memories and navigation abilities. There was no guarantee that bear number 394 wouldn't simply make his way back toward human populations when food became scarce again. Long-term captivity was expensive and arguably inhumane for a wild animal. And the third option, euthanasia, was always the most difficult decision wildlife managers had to make. Public opinion on the bear's fate was sharply divided. Animal rights activists organized protests and petition drives, arguing that bear number 394 was simply following his natural instincts and shouldn't be punished for human encroachment on his habitat. Others, particularly parents and community members who had been directly affected by the attack, argued that public safety had to take priority over the life of one dangerous animal. The decision would ultimately rest with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks. But the political and emotional pressure surrounding the case meant that whatever choice they made would be controversial and closely scrutinized. As the immediate crisis began to fade into ongoing investigation and recovery, the long-term impacts of the attack became more apparent. St. Mary's Catholic Church faced repair costs that could exceed $500,000, much of it not covered by insurance due to the unprecedented nature of the damage. The parish, like many small religious communities, operated on a tight budget with limited reserves for major capital expenditures. Father Brennan found himself spending as much time meeting with insurance adjusters, construction contractors, and fundraising consultants as he did providing pastoral care to his traumatized congregation. The practical challenges of rebuilding were compounded by the emotional challenge of helping his community process what had happened to them. "Some of our parishioners are struggling with their faith," he confided to Bishop Robert Morlino during a visit to assess the situation. "They're asking how God could allow such a thing to happen in his house to people who were gathered to worship him. I'm not sure I have adequate answers for them." Bishop Morlino, a thoughtful man who had dealt with tragedy and crisis throughout his ecclesiastical career, listened carefully before responding. "Perhaps," he suggested, "the answer isn't about why God allowed it to happen, but about how God was present in the midst of it. No one died, Michael, in a situation where a 640-pound grizzly bear broke into a building with nearly 100 people, including many children and elderly parishioners. No one died. Perhaps that's the miracle we should be talking about." The bishop's perspective provided Father Brennan with a framework for helping his congregation find meaning in their shared trauma. In the days that followed, he began to incorporate that message into his counseling sessions and the special services being held in the parish hall while the sanctuary was under repair. Margaret O'Sullivan found herself becoming an unexpected symbol of the incident's positive aspects. News outlets picked up the story of how 16-year-old Michael Kowalski had helped her protect 7-year-old Emma during the evacuation, and the image of different generations of parishioners caring for each other resonated with readers and viewers around the world. "That young man didn't hesitate for a second," Margaret told a reporter from the Missoulian. "In the middle of all that chaos and fear, he saw an elderly woman with a child who needed help, and he stepped up. That tells you everything you need to know about the kind of community we have here." Michael, uncomfortable with the media attention but proud of his actions, found that the incident had changed his perspective on community service and helping others. His parents noticed that he was volunteering more at school and in the neighborhood, as if the crisis had awakened something in him about the importance of being ready to help when help was needed. The Kowalski family, like most of the families affected by the attack, found that the incident had brought them closer together, while also forcing them to confront their own vulnerability and mortality in ways they had never expected. Dinner table conversations that had once focused on homework and basketball games now included discussions about emergency preparedness, wildlife safety, and the importance of staying calm in crisis situations. "I keep thinking about how quickly everything changed," Diane told her husband one evening as they watched their children playing in the backyard. "One minute we were sitting in church, listening to Father Brennan's sermon, and the next minute we were running for our lives from a grizzly bear. It makes you realize how fragile our sense of safety and normalcy really is." The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate victims. Mental health professionals in Missoula reported an increase in anxiety-related appointments, particularly among parents who were struggling to balance their children's need to feel safe with the reality that unpredictable dangers could emerge anywhere, even in places traditionally considered sanctuaries. Dr. Patricia Valdez, a trauma counselor who worked with several of the St. Mary's parishioners, observed that different people were processing the incident in very different ways. "Some are experiencing classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress," she explained. "Hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, intrusive thoughts about the incident. But others have shown remarkable resilience, finding ways to integrate the experience into their existing belief systems and worldviews." The resilience factor seemed to correlate with several variables: age, previous experience with crisis situations, strength of social support networks, and religious faith. Parishioners with strong faith traditions were often better equipped to find meaning in their suffering, while those with previous experience in emergency situations, like Tom Riley with his law enforcement background, were better able to maintain perspective on the actual level of danger they had faced. Children, surprisingly, often showed the most adaptive responses. Their natural resilience, combined with the concrete nature of their thinking, allowed many of them to process the incident as a dramatic but ultimately resolved adventure. Emma Mackenzie, for example, had begun incorporating the church bear into her imaginative play, creating stories where she and her great-grandmother were heroes who helped confused animals find their way home. But for some adults, the incident had shaken fundamental assumptions about safety, predictability, and divine protection that would take much longer to rebuild. Eleanor Hartford, the elderly organist whose quick thinking had helped end the crisis, found herself unable to play the organ for several weeks afterward. Every time she sat at the familiar bench, she was overwhelmed by memories of the bear's roars and the sound of splintering wood. "I keep hearing it," she told Father Brennan during one of their counseling sessions. "Even when I'm trying to play hymns, all I can hear is that discordant noise I was making, trying to drive that poor creature away. It's like I've forgotten how to make beautiful music." Father Brennan, drawing on his decades of pastoral counseling experience, helped Eleanor understand that her musical battle with the bear had been an act of courage and creativity under extreme duress. "You saved lives that day," he told her gently. "The music you made wasn't meant to be beautiful in the traditional sense. It was meant to be effective. And it was. Maybe that's its own kind of beauty. The investigation into the incident continued for several weeks, involving multiple agencies and experts who were trying to understand exactly how bear number 394 had made it so far into Missoula without being detected or deterred. The findings revealed a troubling pattern of factors that had combined to create the perfect conditions for the unprecedented attack. Wildlife cameras placed throughout the area showed that bear number 394 had been gradually expanding his range for over a month, moving closer to human habitation with each foray. His route into the city had followed the Clark Fork River corridor, taking advantage of riparian vegetation that provided cover and masked his scent from the detection systems that were supposed to alert authorities to large predator presence. More troublingly, the investigation revealed that several residents had reported seeing a large bear in the weeks leading up to the attack, but these reports had been dismissed or inadequately followed up by authorities who found it difficult to believe that a grizzly would venture so far from traditional habitat. We had at least 6 credible sightings in the 3 weeks prior to the church incident, admitted Fish, Wildlife and Parks Regional Supervisor Janet Morrison during a public hearing on the attack. In hindsight, it's clear that we didn't take these reports seriously enough or respond with sufficient urgency. This represents a failure in our early warning and response systems that we are committed to addressing. The admission of systemic failures in wildlife monitoring and response protocols led to calls for significant changes in how Montana managed human-wildlife conflicts. Environmental groups argued for expanded habitat protection and wildlife corridor preservation, while community safety advocates pushed for more aggressive monitoring and intervention protocols. Dr. Chen found herself at the center of these policy debates, her expertise in grizzly behavior making her a key voice in discussions about preventing future incidents. She testified before the Montana Legislature's Natural Resources Committee, outlining recommendations that included improved early warning systems, better public education about wildlife safety, and expanded funding for non-lethal bear management techniques. The incident at St. Mary's Church was a wake-up call, she told the legislators. Climate change and habitat fragmentation are forcing wildlife into closer contact with human communities throughout the West. We can either prepare for this reality by developing better management strategies, or we can wait for more incidents like this one to occur. Her recommendations were comprehensive and expensive, including proposals for expanded wildlife monitoring technology, increased funding for bear-resistant garbage systems in residential areas, and the creation of rapid response teams equipped with non-lethal deterrent tools. But even as policy experts debated long-term solutions, the immediate question of bear number 394's fate remained unresolved. The massive grizzly had been held at the secure wildlife facility for over a month, with no clear decision about his future. The delay was causing increased costs and political pressure, while animal rights activists maintained a constant vigil outside the facility. The decision came on a cold November morning, announced at a somber press conference held at the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks headquarters in Helena. Bear number 394 would be relocated to a remote area of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, far from any human habitation, equipped with an advanced GPS tracking collar that would monitor his movements for the rest of his life. This decision reflects our commitment to preserving wildlife whenever possible while also protecting public safety, announced Department Director Sarah Ramos. Bear number 394 will be relocated to habitat that can support his needs without putting him in contact with human communities. However, if he ventures toward populated areas again, more permanent measures will be necessary. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Animal rights groups celebrated the decision as a victory for wildlife preservation, while some community members expressed concern that the bear remained a potential threat. Father Brennan, speaking for many of the church attack victims, issued a statement supporting the relocation while emphasizing the need for continued vigilance. We are grateful that this magnificent creature will have another chance at life in his natural habitat, the statement read. Our prayers go with him as he returns to the wilderness where he belongs. At the same time, we trust that wildlife officials will continue to monitor the situation and take appropriate action if public safety is threatened again. The relocation took place on a snowy December morning, with bear number 394 transported by helicopter to a remote valley deep in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The massive grizzly emerged from his transport cage and immediately disappeared into the dense forest, his GPS collar the only trace of his presence in the vast wilderness. Dr. Chen watched the bear disappear into the trees and felt a complex mix of professional satisfaction and personal concern. The relocation represented the best possible outcome under difficult circumstances, but she knew that the underlying factors that had driven bear number 394 into Missoula remained unchanged. Climate change, habitat fragmentation, and human encroachment on wildlife territory continued to create conditions that made similar incidents increasingly likely. As winter settled over Montana, life in Missoula gradually returned to something approaching normalcy. St. Mary's Church completed its repairs and renovations, with the destroyed stained glass window replaced by a new creation that incorporated elements honoring both the church's history and the community's resilience in the face of crisis. The new window, designed by a local artist working with surviving fragments of the original glass, depicted the biblical scene of Noah's Ark, with particular emphasis on the peaceful coexistence of humans and wildlife. The centerpiece was a figure representing Saint Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of animals, surrounded by Montana wildlife, including deer, elk, eagles, and yes, bears. It seemed appropriate, Father Brennan explained during the window's dedication ceremony, to commemorate not just what we survived, but what we learned. We share this world with creatures great and small, and our calling is to find ways to coexist peacefully with all of God's creation. The dedication ceremony took place on a bright Sunday morning in March, exactly 5 months after the attack. Most of the original congregation was present, along with many visitors and community members who had been drawn to St. Mary's by its story of survival and resilience. Margaret O'Sullivan sat in her familiar third-row pew with Emma beside her. The little girl, now 8 years old, had continued to process the incident with the remarkable adaptability of childhood. She had written a story for her second-grade class about the bear who came to church, complete with illustrations showing the bear returning to his forest home where he could find proper food and live happily. The Kowalski family occupied their usual fifth-row position, their bonds strengthened by the shared experience of crisis and survival. Michael, now a senior in high school with college acceptance letters beginning to arrive, had written his application essays about learning to help others in times of crisis. Several universities had specifically mentioned the incident in their acceptance letters, noting his maturity and character as demonstrated during the church attack. Mrs. Eleanor Hartford had returned to her organ bench, her music richer and more nuanced than ever before. Her experience during the attack had given her a deeper appreciation for the power of music to affect both human and animal behavior, and she had begun composing pieces that incorporated natural sounds and themes from the wilderness. Tom Riley continued serving as head usher, but he had also become the parish's unofficial emergency preparedness coordinator, working with Father Brennan and local authorities to develop comprehensive crisis response protocols that could be applied to various emergency scenarios. Dr. Rebecca Chen was present for the ceremony, her expertise in grizzly behavior having made her an honorary member of the St. Mary's community. She provided periodic updates on bear number 394's progress in the wilderness, reporting that the GPS collar showed him ranging widely through appropriate habitat and successfully avoiding human. The next stories. The Ice Hunter's Last Dawn. The morning of December 14, 2024, began like countless others for Robert Bobby Allen, with the pre-dawn darkness of Nome, Alaska, wrapping around him like a familiar shroud. At 68 years old, Bobby had been fishing these treacherous waters for over 4 decades, his weathered hands knowing every knot, every current, every subtle shift in the ice that could mean the difference between a good catch and disaster. The temperature hung at -23 degrees Fahrenheit, a brutal cold that would have sent most men scurrying for warmth, but for Bobby, it was just another day at the office. Bobby's alarm had buzzed at 4:15 a.m. in his small cabin on West 2nd Avenue, a modest structure that had housed 3 generations of Allen fishermen. The walls were lined with faded photographs of legendary catches, certificates from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and a collection of fishing nets that had seen better days, but still held the stories of thousands of successful hauls. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years prior, leaving him alone with his rituals and his nets, finding solace in the rhythmic patterns of a life lived entirely on the edge of the Bering Sea. As Bobby pulled on his thermal undergarments, the fabric rough against skin that had grown tougher than leather over the decades, he thought about the conversation he'd had the night before with his fishing partner, Tom Erickson. Tom, 55 and Bobby's junior by 13 years, had expressed concerns about the ice conditions near the Seward Peninsula. "The edge is moving more than usual this season," Tom had said over steaming cups of coffee at the Polar Cafe on Front Street. "Ice is singing different songs, Bobby. Maybe we should stick closer to shore for a few more weeks." But Bobby Allen had never been one to let caution override opportunity. The Alaskan king crab season was in full swing, and the waters near the ice edge often yielded the richest catches. His nets, crafted with precision and maintained with religious dedication, were perfectly positioned along the shifting boundaries between solid ice and the dark, churning waters of the Bering Sea. These nets represented not just his livelihood, but his legacy, each one hand-repaired and strategically placed based on decades of accumulated wisdom about fish behavior, current patterns, and the subtle mathematics of survival in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. The fishing community. Tom Erickson lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of Nome with his wife Sandra and their 2 teenage children, Jake and Michelle. Originally from Minnesota, Tom had come to Alaska 15 years earlier, chasing the promise of lucrative fishing contracts, and had found himself drawn into Bobby's orbit through a combination of necessity and genuine respect for the older man's encyclopedic knowledge of local waters. Tom's background included 2 years of community college studying marine biology, making him uniquely equipped to understand both the scientific and practical aspects of their work. The third member of their informal fishing collective was James Jimmy Kowalski, a 32-year-old former Coast Guard mechanic who had settled in Nome after completing his military service. Jimmy brought technical expertise to their operations, maintaining their boat engines, GPS systems, and radio equipment with military precision. He lived alone in a converted garage apartment behind the Nome Marine Center, spending his evenings studying diesel engine manuals and maintaining an extensive collection of tools that had become essential to their fishing operations. Sarah Chen, a marine biologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, had been studying polar bear behavior patterns along the Seward Peninsula for the past 18 months. Her research focused on the relationship between changing ice conditions and predator hunting patterns, particularly how climate variations affected the traditional boundaries between marine mammals and human fishing activities. Sarah's work had brought her into contact with local fishermen, including Bobby's group, as she sought to understand how experienced locals adapted to environmental changes that her sophisticated instruments could measure, but not necessarily predict. Dr. Michael Harrison, the regional wildlife biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, had been monitoring polar bear populations in the Nome region for over a decade. His reports consistently noted the increasing frequency of bear encounters near human fishing areas, a trend he attributed to shifting ice patterns and changing prey availability. Harrison's office maintained detailed records of every polar bear sighting, including extensive documentation of individual bears' behavior patterns, territory ranges, and interaction history with human populations. The Emergency Response Network. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Martinez commanded the Alaska National Guard's 297th Infantry Regiment, based out of Nome. Her unit maintained responsibility for search and rescue operations across a territory encompassing over 50,000 square miles of some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Martinez, a veteran of 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan, had found herself uniquely qualified for the logistical and leadership challenges of Arctic rescue operations, though nothing in her military training had fully prepared her for the psychological weight of civilian casualties in the wilderness. Dr. Jennifer Walsh served as the Chief of Emergency Medicine at Norton Sound Regional Hospital in Nome, the primary medical facility for a region spanning thousands of square miles. Her emergency room had treated everything from routine fishing injuries to complex hypothermia cases, but polar bear attacks represented a category of trauma that challenged even her extensive experience. Walsh had completed her residency in trauma surgery in Detroit before moving to Alaska, drawn by the unique medical challenges and the opportunity to serve communities with limited access to specialized care. Captain Douglas "Doug" Reeves piloted the Coast Guard helicopter stationed at Nome, a Sikorsky MH-60 Jayhawk that served as the primary search and rescue asset for the region. With over 3,000 flight hours in Arctic conditions, Reeves had developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate in weather conditions that would ground most aircraft. His crew included aviation survival technician First Class Maria Santos, whose training in emergency medicine and technical rescue operations had saved dozens of lives over her 8-year career. Detective Ray Morrison of the Alaska State Troopers had been investigating wildlife-related incidents for 7 years, developing expertise in reconstructing animal attack scenarios through physical evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis. Morrison's background included specialized training in forensic investigation techniques adapted for wilderness environments, where traditional crime scene protocols required significant modification to account for weather, wildlife, and the vast distances between incidents and investigative resources. The morning of December 14th. On the morning of December 14th, Bobby's routine began with checking weather reports on his aging but reliable marine radio. The National Weather Service forecast called for temperatures ranging from -20 to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds from the northeast at 15 to 20 knots, and visibility reduced to approximately 1 mile due to ice fog. These conditions represented optimal fishing weather by Nome standards. Cold enough to maintain stable ice formations, but not so severe as to create insurmountable safety hazards for experienced operators. Bobby's breakfast consisted of black coffee, 2 fried eggs, and toast with homemade strawberry jam that Margaret had canned during their final summer together. As he ate, he studied tide charts and ice reports with the methodical attention that had kept him alive through thousands of similar mornings. The tide would be optimal for net checking between 8:30 and 11 a.m., providing the water depth and current conditions necessary for efficient crab harvesting. At 5:45 a.m., Bobby loaded his gear into his 1997 Ford F-250 pickup truck, a vehicle that had accumulated over 300,000 miles, navigating the brutal roads and non-roads of western Alaska. His equipment included insulated waders, ice picks, emergency flares, a satellite communicator, a first aid kit, emergency food supplies, and 3 different types of fishing nets, each designed for specific conditions and target species. The truck's bed also contained a portable ice shelter, propane heater, and enough emergency gear to survive several days in the event of unexpected weather changes or equipment failure. The drive to the ice edge took Bobby through Nome's sleeping streets, past the weathered storefronts and empty lots that gave the town its distinctive end-of-the-world character. Nome existed as a community of approximately 4,000 souls, most of whom derived their livelihoods from fishing, mining, or the complex logistics of supporting human life at the edge of the Arctic Ocean. The town's economy revolved around seasonal patterns that had remained largely unchanged for generations, despite the technological advances that had transformed most of Alaska. Richardson Point, Bobby's destination, lay approximately 12 miles northeast of Nome, where a combination of underwater topography and current patterns created ideal conditions for king crab populations. The location, known locally as Richardson Point, featured a gradually sloping underwater shelf that provided perfect habitat for crabs while remaining accessible to small boat fishing operations. The area had been Bobby's primary fishing ground for over 20 years, yielding consistent catches that had supported his family through good years and bad. The ice road to Richardson Point followed a route that had been used by fishermen for decades, marked by a series of wooden stakes and reflective markers that remained visible even in the worst weather conditions. The road itself consisted of packed snow over frozen ground, maintained by the collective efforts of local fishing families who understood that their economic survival depended on reliable access to productive fishing areas. During extreme weather, the road became impassable even for experienced drivers, but December 14th presented no unusual challenges. Bobby arrived at Richardson Point at approximately 6:30 a.m., parking his truck in a designated area about 200 yards from the ice edge. The location had been chosen by generations of fishermen as the optimal balance between accessibility and safety, close enough to the water for efficient equipment transport, but far enough from the unstable ice edge to avoid the risk of vehicles breaking through weakening ice formations. The morning sky showed the first hints of the brief Arctic dawn, with deep purple and orange hues painting the horizon where the ice sheet met the open ocean. The temperature had dropped to -25 degrees, and a light northeast wind created small snow devils that danced across the ice surface. Visibility remained good, with the ice edge clearly defined against the dark water of the Bering Sea. Bobby's first task involved checking the stability of the ice between his parking area and the fishing location. Using an ice spear, he tested the thickness and consistency of the ice at regular intervals, following a path he had established through years of experience. The ice measured consistently between 18 and 24 inches thick, well within safe parameters for foot travel while carrying equipment. The surface showed the characteristic blue-white color that indicated solid, high-quality ice formation. The net system. His nets had been set 3 days earlier in a pattern designed to intercept crab movement along the underwater shelf. Each net was anchored with concrete weights and marked with fluorescent orange buoys that remained visible even in low-light conditions. The spacing between nets had been calculated to maximize coverage while minimizing the risk of losing equipment to shifting ice or strong currents. Bobby's system represented the culmination of decades of refinement, with each component selected and positioned based on accumulated knowledge about local conditions and crab behavior. As Bobby began his equipment check, he noticed several sets of tracks in the snow near the ice edge. Seals, most likely, though the prints had been partially obscured by wind-blown snow. Seal activity often indicated good fishing conditions, as crabs and other marine life were typically more active in areas where seals were hunting. The tracks led toward the water's edge, suggesting recent seal activity that might have disturbed the seafloor in ways that would drive crabs toward his net locations. The first net check began at approximately 7:15 a.m. Bobby used a systematic approach developed over decades of experience, beginning with the net closest to shore and working progressively toward the ice edge. Each net required careful handling to avoid damage to both the equipment and any captured crabs. The process involved attaching a mechanical hauler to the net rope, slowly raising the net through the water column and examining the contents before either harvesting the catch or returning undersized specimens to the water. The first net yielded 7 keeper-sized king crabs and several smaller specimens that Bobby returned to the water in accordance with Alaska Department of Fish and Game regulations. The crabs showed excellent quality, with hard shells and substantial meat content that indicated healthy populations and favorable environmental conditions. Bobby's practiced eye could assess crab quality instantly, distinguishing between specimens that would command premium prices and those better left to continue growing. The second net, located approximately 50 yards further from shore, contained 12 crabs of various sizes, including 3 specimens that exceeded the minimum size requirements by substantial margins. These larger crabs represented significant economic value, as market prices for premium Alaska king crab had reached record highs during the 2024 season. Bobby worked efficiently but carefully, using proper handling techniques to avoid injury to both himself and the crabs. The approach of danger. As Bobby approached the third net location, positioned closest to the active ice edge, he noticed that the ice conditions had changed slightly since his previous visit. The constant movement of tides and currents had created small pressure ridges and areas where the ice showed stress patterns. These changes were normal and expected, but they required constant vigilance to avoid stepping on weakened sections that might not support human weight. The third net showed signs of having been disturbed, possibly by seal activity or strong currents. The buoy marker had shifted approximately 10 feet from its original position, and the net rope showed tension patterns that suggested significant force had been applied. Such disturbances were common and rarely indicated problems beyond the need for careful handling during net retrieval. At approximately 8:45 a.m., as Bobby began raising the third net, he noticed movement in the water near the ice edge. Initially, he assumed the disturbance was caused by seals or other marine life attracted to the fishing activity. The water in the area showed the characteristic dark color of deep ocean, contrasting sharply with the white ice surface and creating a visual boundary that experienced fishermen learned to respect and monitor constantly. The net retrieval process required Bobby to position himself within approximately 15 feet of the ice edge, a distance that represented the optimal balance between equipment access and personal safety. His decades of experience had taught him to constantly monitor ice conditions, weather changes, and any signs of environmental instability that might require immediate withdrawal from the fishing area. As Bobby worked the mechanical hauler, raising the net through approximately 40 feet of water, he became aware of a disturbance in the water that seemed larger and more purposeful than typical seal activity. The movement created subtle changes in water color and surface patterns that his trained eye recognized as indicators of large marine life. Initially, his assumption was that a whale or large seal was feeding in the area, a common occurrence that usually presented no danger to fishermen working from stable ice positions. The polar bear. The net broke the surface at approximately 8:52 a.m., revealing a substantial catch that included 15 king crabs of various sizes and several other species of marine life. The weight and bulk of the catch required careful handling to avoid equipment damage and ensure the safety of both the fishermen and the harvested specimens. Bobby worked with the methodical precision of someone who had performed similar operations thousands of times, but remained alert to environmental conditions that might require rapid response. As Bobby began sorting the catch, examining each crab for size, quality, and regulatory compliance, the disturbance in the water intensified. The movement pattern suggested something much larger than typical marine life, creating wave patterns and water displacement that experienced Arctic fishermen recognized as potentially significant. However, Bobby's attention remained focused on his catch, as the economic value of the crabs required immediate attention to ensure optimal preservation and handling. At 8:54 a.m., approximately 100 yards from Bobby's position, a polar bear surfaced at the ice edge. The bear had been hunting beneath the ice, using techniques that represent millions of years of evolutionary adaptation to Arctic marine environments. Polar bears are capable of remaining submerged for over 2 minutes while hunting, using their powerful swimming abilities and acute underwater senses to locate prey. This particular bear, an adult male weighing approximately 800 pounds, had been tracking seal activity in the area for several hours. The bear's hunting behavior followed patterns that have been documented by Arctic researchers for decades. Male polar bears, particularly during the late fall and early winter months, typically hunt alone and cover vast territories in search of seals and other marine prey. Their hunting success depends on their ability to remain undetected while approaching prey animals, often using the ice edge as camouflage and ambush positions. This specific bear, later identified through DNA analysis as a male approximately 12 years old, had been tracked by researchers as part of ongoing studies of polar bear population dynamics and hunting behavior. Radio collar data indicated that the bear had traveled over 300 miles during the previous month, following ice formations and prey concentrations along the Alaskan coast. The bear's hunting range encompassed an area of several thousand square miles, including territories that frequently overlapped with human fishing and hunting activities. Research and documentation. Dr. Sarah Chen's research had documented this particular bear's behavior patterns over the previous 18 months, noting that the animal showed typical territorial and hunting behaviors, but had demonstrated increasing tolerance for human presence. The bear had been observed on multiple occasions near fishing operations, usually maintaining distances of several hundred yards while monitoring human activities. These observations were consistent with documented behavioral adaptations that polar bears develop in response to changing Arctic environments. Wildlife biologist Dr. Michael Harrison's files contained extensive documentation of polar bear encounters in the Nome region, including detailed analysis of factors that contributed to aggressive encounters versus peaceful coexistence. His research indicated that polar bears typically avoided direct confrontation with humans unless defending cubs, protecting food sources, or responding to perceived threats. However, environmental factors such as reduced ice coverage, changing prey availability, and increased human activity in traditional bear territories were contributing to more frequent encounters. The bear's approach to Bobby's fishing location followed hunting patterns that researchers have observed in polar bears for generations. The animal used the ice edge as concealment, swimming beneath the surface while monitoring conditions above. Polar bears possess exceptional underwater vision and can detect movement, vibration, and scent patterns from considerable distances while submerged. The bear's approach was deliberate and calculated, consistent with hunting behavior rather than random movement. At 8:55 a.m., Bobby noticed the bear's presence for the first time. The animal had surfaced approximately 75 yards from his position, its massive head breaking the water surface with minimal disturbance. Bobby's initial reaction was typical of experienced Arctic residents: awareness without panic, recognition of potential danger, combined with confidence in his ability to manage the situation through established protocols. Bobby's training and experience had prepared him for polar bear encounters, though direct confrontations remained extremely rare. His standard protocol involved making noise to alert the bear to his presence, slowly backing away from the ice edge while avoiding sudden movements, and using emergency communication equipment to alert other fishermen and authorities if the situation escalated. Bobby carried bear spray and emergency flares, though the effectiveness of such measures against polar bears remained questionable. The encounter escalates. The bear's behavior initially appeared consistent with normal curiosity rather than aggressive intent. The animal remained motionless in the water, observing Bobby's activities without showing obvious signs of predatory behavior. Bobby continued his work while maintaining visual contact with the bear, following protocols developed through decades of coexistence between polar bears and human populations in the Arctic. At 8:56 a.m., Bobby activated his satellite communicator, sending a routine message to Tom Erickson and Jimmy Kowalski, indicating his location and the presence of polar bear activity in the area. The message was intended as a precautionary measure rather than an emergency alert, consistent with established protocols for reporting wildlife encounters. The satellite communicator represented Bobby's primary emergency communication system, capable of transmitting location and brief text messages even in extreme weather conditions. Tom Erickson received Bobby's message while conducting engine maintenance on their primary fishing vessel at Nome Marine Center. Tom's immediate response was to monitor radio frequencies for additional communications while continuing his planned maintenance activities. The message itself did not indicate immediate danger, as polar bear sightings were relatively common during the winter fishing season. Tom's experience suggested that most bear encounters resolved peacefully, provided fishermen followed established safety protocols. Jimmy Kowalski was testing radio equipment at his apartment when Bobby's satellite message arrived. Jimmy's technical background made him acutely aware of communication system limitations and the importance of maintaining contact with team members during potentially hazardous operations. He immediately began monitoring emergency frequencies and prepared to coordinate rescue operations if Bobby's situation deteriorated. The bear began moving closer to Bobby's position at approximately 8:57 a.m., swimming along the ice edge with powerful, deliberate strokes. Polar bears are exceptional swimmers, capable of maintaining speeds of up to 6 miles per hour in water and covering distances of over 60 miles without rest. The bear's swimming technique demonstrated the efficient, energy-conserving movements that allow these predators to hunt successfully in marine environments. Bobby's response to the bear's approach followed established protocols, but the animal's behavior began showing characteristics that experienced wildlife observers recognize as potentially problematic. The bear maintained direct eye contact with Bobby while approaching, a behavior pattern that can indicate predatory interest rather than simple curiosity. Additionally, the bear's swimming speed and direction suggested purposeful movement toward Bobby's location rather than coincidental travel along the ice edge. Emergency protocols. Activated at 8:58 a.m., Bobby began implementing emergency protocols, securing his equipment and preparing to withdraw from the ice edge. However, the bear's proximity and approach angle made immediate retreat potentially more dangerous than maintaining his current position while monitoring the situation. Bobby's decades of Arctic experience had taught him that sudden movements and panic responses often triggered aggressive behavior in polar bears, while calm, deliberate actions typically allowed for peaceful resolution of encounters. The bear reached a position approximately 30 yards from Bobby's location and paused, floating motionlessly while continuing to observe Bobby's activities. This behavior represented a critical decision point in polar bear encounters, the moment when the animal's intentions become apparent through subsequent actions. Bobby remained calm but alert, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether the encounter remained peaceful or escalated to a life-threatening situation. Bobby's emergency equipment included bear spray, signal flares, and a satellite communicator capable of transmitting emergency alerts to Coast Guard rescue services. However, the effectiveness of defensive measures against polar bears in marine environments remained questionable, as these predators had evolved specifically to hunt in conditions similar to those Bobby currently faced. His primary advantages lay in his experience, knowledge of bear behavior, and the hope that the animal would lose interest and move on to other hunting opportunities. At 8:59 a.m., the bear began moving again, this time approaching Bobby's position more directly. The animal's swimming technique changed subtly, showing characteristics that wildlife experts recognize as hunting behavior rather than exploration. Polar bears approaching prey typically show increased focus, more direct movement patterns, and behavioral changes that indicate the transition from curiosity to predatory intent. Bobby made the decision to abandon his equipment and begin withdrawing from the ice edge, but the bear's speed and approach angle made retreat increasingly difficult. The animal was now less than 20 yards away and closing rapidly. Bobby activated the emergency alert function on his satellite communicator, transmitting a distress signal that included his GPS coordinates and emergency status code. The emergency response begins. The emergency alert reached Coast Guard communications at exactly 9 a.m., triggering immediate response protocols for polar bear attack situations. The alert included Bobby's precise GPS coordinates, emergency status indicators, and automated distress beacon activation. Coast Guard Duty Officer Petty Officer Second Class Maria Rodriguez immediately initiated search and rescue protocols while attempting to establish voice communication with Bobby's location. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Martinez received notification of Bobby's distress alert at 9:01 a.m. through Alaska National Guard emergency response networks. Her unit maintained primary responsibility for coordinating large-scale search and rescue operations, including polar bear attack responses that required multiple agency coordination. Martinez immediately began assembling resources while monitoring Coast Guard communication attempts with Bobby's position. Captain Douglas Reeves received emergency flight orders at 9:02 a.m., directing immediate helicopter deployment to Bobby's coordinates. Weather conditions remained within operational parameters for rescue helicopter operations, though the remote location and potential polar bear presence would require specialized approach techniques and coordinated ground support operations. At 9:03 a.m., the polar bear reached the ice edge directly in front of Bobby's position. The animal's massive size became apparent as it approached the ice, with adult male polar bears capable of reaching lengths of over 10 feet and weights exceeding 800 pounds. The bear's physical capabilities represented evolutionary adaptations for hunting marine mammals, including powerful swimming ability, exceptional strength, and predatory instincts developed over millions of years. Bobby attempted to use bear spray as the animal approached the ice edge, but wind conditions and the bear's position in the water limited the effectiveness of the deterrent. Polar bears possess exceptional tolerance for environmental challenges, including chemical irritants that might deter other predator species. The bear continued its approach without visible reaction to the deterrent spray. The attack. The bear pulled itself onto the ice at 9:04 a.m., demonstrating the remarkable upper body strength that allows polar bears to haul themselves from water onto ice surfaces using only their front claws. The transition from water to ice represents a critical moment in polar bear attacks, as the animal's mobility and threat level increase dramatically once it gains solid footing. Bobby began backing away from the ice edge as rapidly as ice conditions allowed, but the bear's speed on solid ice exceeded human movement capabilities by substantial margins. Polar bears can achieve running speeds of up to 25 miles per hour on ice, compared to maximum human speeds of approximately 6 miles per hour under similar conditions. The bear's advantage in speed, combined with its size and strength, created a situation where escape became increasingly unlikely. At 9:05 a.m., the polar bear began its final approach toward Bobby's position. The animal's behavior showed all the characteristics that wildlife experts recognize as predatory attack patterns: direct movement, focused attention, and the calculated approach techniques that polar bears use when hunting seals and other prey. The bear moved with purpose and efficiency, closing the distance between itself and Bobby with devastating speed. Bobby's final communication attempt occurred at 9:05 a.m. and 30 seconds, consisting of a brief transmission indicating bear attack in progress before communication ceased. The transmission was received by Coast Guard Communications and immediately relayed to all agencies involved in the emergency response. The brevity and content of the message indicated that the situation had escalated beyond containment and required immediate rescue response. The polar bear attack began at approximately 9:06 a.m., with the animal covering the final 20 feet between itself and Bobby in less than 3 seconds. Polar bears attack with remarkable speed and precision, using techniques that have been refined through millions of years of predatory evolution. The initial contact typically involves powerful strikes from the bear's front paws, followed by bite attacks directed at the prey's head and neck area. Bobby's experience and physical condition provided some defensive capability, but the size and strength differential between humans and polar bears makes survival of direct attacks extremely unlikely. Adult male polar bears possess bite forces exceeding 1,200 pounds per square inch, and claw strength capable of breaking through ice formations several inches thick. Their attack techniques represent evolutionary adaptations for killing marine mammals much larger and stronger than humans. The attack lasted approximately 90 seconds, during which Bobby fought with the courage and determination that had characterized his entire life. However, the physical mismatch between human capabilities and polar bear predatory abilities made the outcome inevitable from the moment direct contact occurred. Bobby's final moments demonstrated the same bravery and resilience that had sustained him through decades of survival in one of Earth's most challenging environments. At 9:07 a.m. and 30 seconds, the polar bear dragged Bobby's body into the water, following behavior patterns that researchers have documented in polar bear predation. These predators typically transport their prey to secure locations where feeding can occur without interference from other predators or environmental hazards. The bear's actions were consistent with normal predatory behavior rather than defensive or territorial responses. Undi rescue operations commence. Tom Erickson attempted to establish radio contact with Bobby beginning at 9:10 a.m., responding to the emergency alert notifications he had received through Coast Guard Communications. Tom's calls received no response, prompting immediate departure from Nome Marine Center toward Richardson Point in coordination with emergency response agencies. Tom's knowledge of Bobby's habits and fishing locations made him essential to search and rescue operations. Jimmy Kowalski departed for Richardson Point at 9:12 a.m., driving his own vehicle while maintaining radio communication with emergency response agencies. Jimmy's technical expertise and familiarity with Bobby's equipment made him valuable for search operations and evidence recovery. His military background provided relevant experience for coordinating with rescue agencies and managing emergency communications. Captain Douglas Reeves launched Coast Guard helicopter operations at 9:15 a.m., departing Nome with a full search and rescue crew, including aviation survival technician Maria Santos and flight mechanic Petty Officer First Class David Kim. The helicopter followed a direct route to Bobby's last known coordinates, maintaining communication with ground-based rescue teams and monitoring weather conditions that might affect rescue operations. The helicopter crew reached Bobby's location at 9:28 a.m., observing evidence of the attack, including disturbed ice, scattered fishing equipment, and blood traces near the ice edge. Visual inspection revealed no signs of Bobby or the polar bear, indicating that both had entered the water following the attack. The crew immediately began systematic search patterns while coordinating with arriving ground-based rescue teams. Tom Erickson and Jimmy Kowalski reached Richardson Point at 9:35 a.m., finding Bobby's truck parked in the designated area but showing no signs of Bobby himself. Initial ground-based assessment revealed obvious signs of struggle near the third net location, including damaged equipment, blood traces, and polar bear tracks in the snow. The evidence clearly indicated that a fatal attack had occurred, though Bobby's body remained missing. Detective Ray Morrison of the Alaska State Troopers arrived at Richardson Point at 9:45 a.m. to begin preliminary investigation of the attack scene. Morrison's specialized training in wildlife attack reconstruction allowed him to interpret physical evidence and develop accurate understanding of the sequence of events. His investigation would ultimately provide essential information for wildlife management agencies and legal proceedings related to the attack. Expanded search efforts. Dr. Sarah Chen received notification of the polar bear attack at 10:15 a.m. through University of Alaska research networks that monitored wildlife incidents involving tagged animals. Her research data indicated that the attacking bear was likely the same individual she had been studying, providing crucial behavioral and movement data for understanding the attack circumstances. Chen immediately began preparing to travel to the scene to assist with wildlife behavior analysis. Coast Guard search operations continued throughout the morning, with helicopter crews conducting systematic search patterns in waters surrounding the attack location. The search area encompassed approximately 50 square miles, accounting for current patterns, tidal movements, and typical polar bear behavior following predatory attacks. Additional Coast Guard vessels were dispatched from other Alaskan stations to support the search effort. Alaska National Guard ground teams arrived at Richardson Point at 10:30 a.m., establishing a command post and coordinating with Coast Guard air operations. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Martinez assumed overall command of the rescue operation, implementing protocols developed for polar bear attack responses that required coordination between multiple agencies and specialized equipment. The National Guard's Arctic warfare training provided essential expertise for operations in extreme weather conditions. Wildlife biologist Dr. Michael Harrison arrived at the scene at 11 a.m. to assess polar bear activity and provide expert consultation on search operations. Harrison's knowledge of polar bear behavior patterns helped focus search efforts on areas where bears typically transport prey following successful hunts. His recommendations influenced search priorities and safety protocols for rescue personnel. The search for Bobby's remains continued for 6 days, involving over 200 personnel from Coast Guard, Alaska National Guard, state troopers, and volunteer organizations. Aircraft conducted systematic visual searches, while ground teams examined ice formations and shoreline areas where bodies might be recovered. Underwater search operations were limited by extreme weather conditions and the remote location. On December 20th, 6 days after the attack, Bobby's fishing vest was recovered approximately 2 miles from the attack location, providing the first concrete evidence of his fate. The vest showed extensive damage consistent with polar bear predation and had been partially buried in snow along the shoreline. DNA analysis confirmed that the vest belonged to Bobby and contained biological evidence from the attacking polar bear. Additional equipment recovery occurred over the following weeks, including fragments of Bobby's waders, pieces of his fishing gear, and personal items that had been scattered by the bear or washed ashore by tidal action. Each recovery provided additional evidence for investigators and helped family members understand the circumstances of Bobby's death. However, Bobby's body was never recovered, likely consumed by the polar bear or lost in the Bering Sea. Wildlife Management Response. The polar bear responsible for Bobby's death was tracked by wildlife authorities for 3 weeks following the attack, using helicopter surveillance and radio collar data from Dr. Chen's research program. The bear showed normal behavior patterns following the attack, suggesting that the incident represented opportunistic predation rather than aberrant behavior. Wildlife management authorities ultimately decided against destroying the bear, as the attack occurred in the animal's natural habitat during normal hunting activities. Dr. Jennifer Walsh at Norton Sound Regional Hospital prepared for potential survivors throughout the emergency response, though the circumstances of Bobby's attack made survival extremely unlikely. Walsh's trauma team remained on standby during the search operations, ready to treat hypothermia, traumatic injuries, or other medical emergencies related to the rescue efforts. Her experience with polar bear attack victims provided sobering perspective on the likely outcome of Bobby's encounter. The investigation into Bobby's death revealed no evidence of human error or negligence that contributed to the attack. Detective Morrison's report concluded that Bobby had followed established safety protocols and possessed extensive experience in Arctic fishing operations. The attack represented an unfortunate encounter between an experienced fisherman and an apex predator in the predator's natural environment, with circumstances that made the outcome tragically inevitable. Media coverage and public reaction. Media coverage of Bobby's death began within hours of the initial emergency response, with local and national news outlets reporting on the polar bear attack. The story attracted international attention due to the dramatic circumstances and the increasing frequency of polar bear encounters in Arctic regions. News crews arrived in Nome within days of the attack, interviewing family members, fishing colleagues, and wildlife experts about the incident and its implications for Arctic communities. CNN's Arctic correspondent Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the doctor, arrived in Nome on December 16th with a camera crew to document the story. Her reports focused on the intersection of climate change, traditional subsistence lifestyles, and increasing human-wildlife conflicts in the Arctic. The story became part of a broader narrative about the challenges facing indigenous and traditional communities as environmental changes altered long-established patterns of coexistence with wildlife. The Associated Press wire service picked up the story on December 15th, distributing it to newspapers across North America and internationally. The article emphasized the rarity of fatal polar bear attacks and the extreme conditions that Arctic fishermen faced in pursuing their livelihoods. International media outlets, including the BBC and Reuters, covered the story as part of ongoing reporting on Arctic environmental issues and climate change impacts. Local Nome media, including Nome Radio and the Nome Nugget newspaper, provided extensive coverage that focused on Bobby's contributions to the community and the impact of his death on local fishing families. These outlets served as primary information sources for residents and provided platforms for community members to share memories and express support for Bobby's family. The coverage helped the community process the tragedy while maintaining focus on Bobby's life and legacy rather than sensationalizing his death. Social media reactions ranged from expressions of sympathy for Bobby's family to debates about polar bear conservation, hunting practices, and climate change. Wildlife conservation groups use the incident to highlight the challenges facing polar bear populations, while hunting and fishing organizations emphasize the risks that traditional communities accepted in pursuing subsistence lifestyles. The online discussions reflected broader societal tensions about balancing human activities with wildlife conservation priorities. Memorial service and community response. Bobby's memorial service was held at the Nome Community Center on December 28th, attended by over 300 people, including family members, fishing colleagues, community leaders, and representatives from emergency response agencies. The service celebrated Bobby's life and contributions to the Nome fishing community, while acknowledging the risks that Arctic residents face in pursuing their livelihoods. Speakers included his brother William Allen, fishing partner Tom Erickson, and Mayor Richard Benneville of Nome. The service began with traditional Inupiat prayers offered by community elder Mary Akinga, recognizing the spiritual connection between the community and the harsh but life-giving environment that sustained them. The prayers acknowledged both Bobby's relationship with the sea and the reality that the Arctic demanded sacrifices from those who chose to make their living from its resources. The spiritual elements reflected the blend of traditional indigenous beliefs and contemporary Christian practices that characterized much of rural Alaska. Tom Erickson's eulogy captured the essence of Bobby's character and the respect he commanded within the fishing community. Bobby Allen wasn't just a fisherman, Tom said, his voice breaking with emotion. He was a teacher, a mentor, and a man who understood that the sea gives and the sea takes away. He taught us all that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done, despite the fear. Bobby faced the ice every morning for 40 years, knowing the risks, because that's what it meant to be a provider, a father, and a member of this community. William Allen spoke about his brother's dedication to family and tradition, sharing stories of their childhood and Bobby's evolution from a young man eager to prove himself to a respected elder who served as a bridge between generations of fishermen. Bobby could read the ice like other people read books, William said. He knew every current, every danger sign, every opportunity. If this could happen to Bobby, it could happen to anyone. That doesn't make us victims. It makes us human beings trying to live with dignity in a place that demands everything we have to give. Mayor Benneville addressed the broader implications of Bobby's death for the Nome community, emphasizing the ongoing challenges of maintaining traditional livelihoods in an increasingly complex world. Bobby Allen represented the best of what we are as a community, Benneville said. He was independent, skilled, courageous, and generous with his knowledge. His death reminds us that we're all connected by the risks we share and the support we give each other. We honor Bobby not by avoiding the risks he took, but by taking them more carefully and with greater awareness of what we have to lose. Economic and practical impacts. The economic impact of Bobby's death extended beyond the immediate loss of an experienced fisherman, affecting the entire local fishing community's confidence and operations. Several fishing families temporarily reduced their activities near ice edges, while others invested in additional safety equipment and communication systems. The Nome fishing industry implemented new safety protocols based on lessons learned from Bobby's attack, though the fundamental risks of Arctic fishing remained unchanged. The immediate economic effects included the loss of Bobby's anticipated seasonal catch, which typically contributed between $45,000 and $65,000 annually to the local economy through direct sales and related services. His fishing territory and equipment represented assets worth approximately $85,000, creating immediate questions about succession and continued operation. The broader economic impact included reduced confidence among other fishermen, leading to more conservative fishing practices that decreased overall productivity during the remainder of the 2024 season. Insurance companies serving the Arctic fishing industry reviewed their policies and risk assessments following Bobby's death, leading to increased premiums and more stringent safety requirements for coverage. The changes reflected growing awareness of climate-related risks and increasing frequency of extreme weather events that contributed to dangerous fishing conditions. Some smaller fishing operations found themselves unable to afford the increased insurance costs, forcing them to operate without coverage or abandon fishing altogether. Equipment suppliers in Nome reported increased sales of emergency communication devices, bear deterrent systems, and cold weather survival gear in the weeks following Bobby's death. Local marine supply stores struggled to meet demand for satellite communicators and emergency beacons, with some items back-ordered for months. The increased safety investments represented significant financial burdens for fishing families already operating on tight margins, but few considered them optional given the circumstances of Bobby's death. The Nome Marine Center, where Tom and Jimmy maintained their equipment, became an informal gathering place for fishermen processing the trauma of Bobby's death and discussing improved safety measures. Conversations focused on practical improvements, such as buddy system protocols, enhanced communication schedules, and group fishing arrangements that would provide better mutual support during dangerous operations. However, the fundamental reality remained that fishing near ice edges required individual risk-taking that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. Psychological trauma and recovery. The psychological impact of Bobby's death affected the entire Nome community, particularly the close-knit fishing families who shared similar risks and dangers. Local mental health services reported increased demand for counseling services related to occupational anxiety and survivor guilt among fishermen who continued working in areas where polar bear encounters remained possible. Community support groups were established to help residents process the trauma and maintain the social cohesion necessary for survival in harsh Arctic conditions. Dr. Lisa Blackwood, a clinical psychologist who had worked with trauma survivors throughout Alaska, was brought to Nome to provide specialized counseling services for those affected by Bobby's death. Her sessions focused on helping community members distinguish between healthy caution and paralyzing fear, emphasizing that survival in the Arctic required calculated risk-taking rather than risk avoidance. Dr. Blackwood's work addressed both individual trauma responses and community-wide effects of losing a respected leader and mentor. Tom Erickson struggled with profound grief and survivor guilt following Bobby's death, questioning his own decision not to accompany Bobby on the morning of December 14th. Tom's family noticed significant changes in his behavior, including reluctance to continue fishing and symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. Professional counseling and support from the fishing community eventually helped Tom process his grief and return to fishing operations, though he never fully recovered from the loss of his mentor and friend. Sandra Erickson, Tom's wife, found herself dealing with increased anxiety about her husband's safety and questioned whether the family should continue living in Nome. Her concerns reflected broader community discussions about the balance between traditional livelihoods and family security. Support groups for fishing families provided platforms for discussing these concerns and developing strategies for managing ongoing risks while maintaining community cohesion. Jimmy Kowalski channeled his grief into advocacy for improved safety equipment and communication systems for Arctic fishermen. He researched and tested advanced satellite communication devices, bear deterrent systems, and emergency rescue equipment that might provide better protection for fishermen working in polar bear territory. Jimmy's technical expertise and military background made him effective in developing practical solutions that balanced safety improvements with the economic realities of small-scale fishing operations. The teenage children of affected families, including Tom's son Jake and daughter Michelle, struggled with understanding their parents' continued commitment to dangerous occupations. School counselors reported increased anxiety and behavioral issues among students whose families depended on fishing for their livelihoods. Educational programs were developed to help young people understand both the risks and the cultural significance of traditional subsistence activities. Scientific research developments. Dr. Sarah Chen's research took on new urgency following Bobby's death, as she worked to understand polar bear behavior patterns that might help predict and prevent future attacks. Her analysis of the attacking bear's movement data revealed that the animal had been hunting in the area for several days before encountering Bobby, suggesting that improved monitoring systems might provide early warning of polar bear presence near fishing areas. However, the vastness of Arctic territories and limitations of tracking technology made comprehensive monitoring impractical. Chen's post-incident analysis included detailed examination of environmental factors that might have contributed to the attack, including ice conditions, prey availability, and weather patterns. Her research indicated that the bear's behavior was consistent with normal hunting patterns rather than abnormal aggression, suggesting that similar encounters might occur whenever polar bears and humans occupied overlapping territories during optimal hunting conditions. The University of Alaska Fairbanks expanded its polar bear research program following Bobby's death, allocating additional funding for studies of human-wildlife interactions in Arctic communities. The expanded research included collaboration with indigenous knowledge holders, combining traditional ecological knowledge with scientific monitoring techniques to develop more comprehensive understanding of polar bear behavior patterns. Wildlife biologist Dr. Michael Harrison's post-incident review led to updated protocols for monitoring polar bear activity near human settlements and work areas. The new protocols emphasized community education and early warning systems while acknowledging the practical limitations of surveillance in vast Arctic territories. Harrison's recommendations focused on improving communication between researchers, wildlife managers, and local communities rather than attempting to control or relocate polar bear populations. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game initiated a comprehensive review of safety protocols for commercial fishing operations in polar bear habitat, incorporating lessons learned from Bobby's death into updated guidelines and training programs. The review process included extensive consultation with fishing families, emergency responders, and wildlife experts to develop practical recommendations that balanced safety improvements with operational requirements. Wildlife management challenges. Wildlife management authorities face difficult decisions about balancing polar bear conservation with human safety concerns following Bobby's death. Dr. Michael Harrison's recommendations emphasized education and awareness rather than population control measures, arguing that polar bears were simply following natural behavior patterns in their traditional territory. The incident highlighted ongoing challenges in managing apex predator populations in areas where human economic activities overlapped with wildlife habitat. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game convened a special committee to review polar bear management policies in light of Bobby's death and similar incidents throughout the Arctic. Committee members included wildlife biologists, representatives from affected communities, emergency response agencies, and conservation organizations. The committee's deliberations reflected the complex balance between protecting both human lives and endangered species in shared environments. Federal wildlife agencies, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, examined whether Bobby's death warranted changes to polar bear protection status or management protocols. The agencies ultimately concluded that the incident represented normal predator behavior in response to appropriate environmental stimuli, rather than evidence of population or behavioral problems requiring intervention. This decision reflected the broader federal commitment to polar bear conservation, despite the tragic human consequences of individual encounters. International polar bear management organizations, including the Polar Bear Specialist Group of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, incorporated data from Bobby's death into their ongoing assessments of human-bear conflict patterns. The incident contributed to growing understanding of how climate change and human activity patterns were affecting the frequency and character of polar bear encounters across the Arctic. The debate over whether to destroy the bear responsible for Bobby's death reflected broader tensions between conservation priorities and community safety concerns. Ultimately, wildlife authorities decided that destroying the bear would not prevent similar future incidents and would remove a healthy breeding-age male from an already vulnerable population. This decision was controversial within the Nome community, but consistent with established wildlife management principles. Long-term community adaptations. Coast Guard search and rescue operations were reviewed and updated based on lessons learned from Bobby's case, particularly regarding response times and coordination protocols for polar bear attacks. Captain Reeves's after-action report identified areas for improvement in communication systems and search techniques, leading to updated training programs and equipment modifications for Arctic rescue operations. However, the fundamental limitations of rescue operations in extreme weather and remote locations remained largely unchanged. The Coast Guard's recommendations included expanded use of satellite tracking devices for fishermen working in high-risk areas, improved coordination protocols between agencies, and enhanced training for helicopter crews responding to wildlife attack emergencies. These improvements represented marginal gains in emergency response capability rather than fundamental changes in the risk profile for Arctic fishing operations. Nome's Emergency Medical Services, led by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, developed enhanced protocols for treating polar bear attack victims, though the rarity and severity of such incidents limited the practical application of these improvements. The protocols emphasized rapid evacuation and trauma care techniques adapted for extreme cold conditions and remote locations. Training exercises were conducted to maintain readiness for polar bear attack responses, though medical professionals acknowledged that survival rates for direct attacks remained extremely low. The Nome fishing community gradually adapted to heightened awareness of polar bear risks, implementing informal buddy systems and improved communication protocols during fishing operations. Families invested in better emergency equipment while maintaining their commitment to fishing as both economic necessity and cultural identity. The community's resilience and adaptation demonstrated the same qualities that had enabled human survival in the Arctic for thousands of years. Fishing families developed informal networks for sharing information about polar bear sightings and ice conditions, using social media and radio communications to maintain awareness of potential dangers. These networks represented community-based solutions that complemented but did not replace official wildlife monitoring systems. The informal information sharing reflected traditional Arctic survival strategies adapted to contemporary communication technologies. Legal and regulatory implications. Legal proceedings related to Bobby's death were limited, as the attack occurred in an area where polar bears had established territorial rights, and Bobby was engaging in legal fishing activities. His family received workers' compensation benefits and life insurance proceeds, while the Alaska Department of Fish and Game reviewed safety regulations for commercial fishing operations in polar bear habitat. No changes to existing regulations were implemented, as investigators concluded that additional rules would not have prevented the attack. The workers' compensation claim required extensive documentation of the circumstances surrounding Bobby's death, including expert testimony about polar bear behavior, fishing industry safety standards, and the reasonableness of Bobby's actions leading up to the attack. The Compensation Board ultimately concluded that Bobby's death resulted from occupational hazards inherent to Arctic fishing rather than negligence or safety violations. Life insurance companies initially questioned whether Bobby's death should be covered under standard policies, arguing that polar bear attacks represented excluded risks similar to acts of war or extreme sports activities. However, legal precedent and the routine nature of Bobby's fishing activities ultimately supported full coverage. The case established important precedents for insurance coverage of wildlife-related deaths in occupational settings. The Alaska State Legislature considered but ultimately rejected proposed legislation that would have required additional safety equipment and protocols for fishing operations in polar bear habitat. Legislators concluded that existing regulations provided adequate frameworks for safety management and that additional requirements would impose unreasonable economic burdens on small-scale fishing operations without significantly improving safety outcomes. Federal agencies reviewed their policies regarding fishing activities in areas designated as critical habitat for polar bears, examining whether additional restrictions or warnings might prevent similar incidents. The review concluded that existing regulations appropriately balance conservation needs with traditional subsistence rights, and that Bobby's death did not warrant changes to federal policies governing human activities in polar bear habitat. Environmental and climate considerations. Bobby's death became part of the broader narrative about climate change and its impact on Arctic ecosystems, as researchers and policymakers examined how environmental changes affected traditional relationships between human populations and wildlife. The incident contributed to ongoing discussions about sustainable development, conservation strategies, and the complex challenges facing Arctic communities in the 21st century. Climate scientists noted that changing ice patterns and reduced sea ice coverage were forcing polar bears to spend more time on land and in areas traditionally used by human communities. Bobby's death occurred during a year when Arctic sea ice reached near record low levels, potentially contributing to increased polar bear presence near human fishing areas. However, researchers cautioned against drawing direct causal connections between climate change and individual attack incidents. Environmental groups used Bobby's death to advocate for stronger climate change mitigation efforts, arguing that reducing greenhouse gas emissions represented the most effective long-term strategy for preventing human polar bear conflicts. Conservation organizations emphasized that protecting polar bear habitat through climate action would ultimately benefit both wildlife populations and human communities that shared Arctic environments. The incident contributed to ongoing research into climate change adaptation strategies for Arctic communities, including studies of how traditional knowledge systems could be combined with scientific monitoring to improve safety and sustainability. Researchers recognized that communities like Nome had developed sophisticated understanding of environmental changes over generations, and that this knowledge represented valuable resources for addressing contemporary challenges. Memorial and legacy initiatives. 1 year after Bobby's death, the Nome community established the Robert Allen Memorial Fund, providing scholarships for young people pursuing careers in marine biology, wildlife management, or Arctic research. The fund reflected the community's desire to honor Bobby's memory while supporting scientific understanding that might prevent similar tragedies. The scholarships were awarded annually to students demonstrating commitment to Arctic conservation and community service. The scholarship program attracted support from throughout Alaska and from national organizations interested in Arctic research and conservation. The first recipients included 2 Nome High School graduates pursuing marine biology degrees and 1 University of Alaska student studying polar bear behavior. The program emphasized practical research applications and community engagement, reflecting Bobby's own approach to learning about and working with Arctic environments. The fishing location where Bobby died became an informal memorial site, marked by a simple wooden cross and fishing net display created by community volunteers. Fishermen working in the area often left small tributes and maintained the memorial as a reminder of both the risks they faced and the legacy of a respected colleague. The memorial served as a focal point for community remembrance and ongoing commitment to fishing traditions despite inherent dangers. Local artists and craftspeople created memorial pieces celebrating Bobby's life and connection to the sea, including carved ivory sculptures, traditional Inupiat artwork, and photographic displays documenting his contributions to the fishing community. These artistic tributes were displayed in public buildings throughout Nome and served as permanent reminders of Bobby's legacy and the ongoing challenges facing Arctic communities. Family succession and continuity. Bobby's brother William eventually took over management of Bobby's fishing equipment and territory, working with Tom Erickson and Jimmy Kowalski to continue the fishing operations that had sustained their family for generations. William's decision to maintain the fishing tradition represented both practical economic necessity and determination to honor Bobby's memory by preserving the way of life he had loved. The transition required significant adjustment and new safety protocols, but ultimately succeeded in maintaining continuity for the fishing operation. William Allen faced the challenge of learning Bobby's sophisticated knowledge of local waters, fish behavior, and equipment management, while dealing with his own grief and the community's traumatic response to his brother's death. The learning process was supported by Tom and Jimmy, who shared their knowledge and maintained the collaborative approach that had characterized Bobby's operations. However, William acknowledged that replacing Bobby's decades of experience would require years of careful attention and continued learning. The transfer of Bobby's fishing permits and equipment required navigation of complex state regulations and family legal issues, complicated by the absence of Bobby's body and questions about the timing of death certification. Legal proceedings ultimately resolved these issues in favor of family continuity, but the process highlighted the administrative challenges facing families who lost members to wilderness accidents in remote locations. Sandra Erickson, Tom's wife, played an increasingly important role in supporting the fishing operation through equipment maintenance, communication coordination, and business management. Her contributions reflected the broader involvement of fishing families in sustaining operations that appeared to be individual enterprises, but actually required extensive family and community support networks. Ongoing research and monitoring research conducted in the years following Bobby's death revealed that polar bear attacks on humans remained statistically rare events, with most encounters ending peacefully when proper protocols were followed. However, the severity of attacks that did occur and the increasing frequency of bear-human encounters emphasized the ongoing challenges facing Arctic communities. Scientists continued studying polar bear behavior, human-wildlife interactions, and environmental factors that influenced encounter outcomes. Dr. Sarah Chen's continued research documented the movements and behavior of the bear responsible for Bobby's death, providing valuable data about polar bears' responses to human encounters and subsequent behavioral patterns. The bear showed no signs of seeking additional human contact and maintained normal hunting and territorial behaviors throughout the following years. This data supported wildlife management decisions to allow the bear to remain in its natural habitat rather than relocating or destroying it. Collaborative research programs were established between university scientists, government agencies, and Arctic communities to improve understanding of human-wildlife interactions and develop better prediction and prevention strategies. These programs emphasized the integration of traditional ecological knowledge with scientific monitoring techniques, recognizing that community members possessed sophisticated understanding of environmental patterns and animal behavior. Long-term monitoring of polar bear populations in the Nome region continued to show stable numbers, but changing distribution patterns consistent with climate-related environmental changes. Wildlife biologists documented increased polar bear presence in areas traditionally used primarily by humans, reflecting adaptations to changing ice conditions and prey availability. These changes suggested that encounters like Bobby's might become more frequent in the future. Community resilience and adaptation. The broader implications of Bobby's death extended beyond Nome to other Arctic communities facing similar challenges with polar bear populations and subsistence activities. His case became part of training materials for emergency response agencies, wildlife management programs, and community education initiatives throughout Alaska and other Arctic regions. The incident contributed to improved understanding of risk management and emergency preparedness in extreme environments. Indigenous knowledge holders throughout Alaska incorporated lessons from Bobby's death into traditional teaching about human-wildlife relationships and survival strategies. Elders emphasized that Bobby's death represented the ongoing reality of Arctic life, rather than evidence that traditional activities had become impossible. The traditional perspective emphasized adaptation and careful attention to environmental signs rather than abandonment of subsistence practices. Federal and state agencies used Bobby's case to evaluate and improve interagency coordination protocols for wildlife emergencies, leading to updated communication systems and response procedures. The improvements represented incremental advances in emergency management rather than fundamental changes in risk levels, but they provided better support for communities facing similar challenges. Training programs for emergency responders throughout Alaska incorporated lessons learned from Bobby's death, including improved protocols for polar bear attack responses, wilderness search operations, and family notification procedures. The training emphasized both technical improvements and sensitivity to community trauma and cultural considerations in Arctic communities. Technological innovations. The aftermath of Bobby's death stimulated development and testing of new safety technologies designed specifically for Arctic fishing operations, including improved satellite communication systems, bear detection devices, and emergency rescue equipment. While these technologies offered marginal improvements in safety and communication capabilities, they could not eliminate the fundamental risks associated with fishing in polar bear territory. Satellite communication companies developed enhanced emergency beacon systems that provided more reliable coverage in extreme northern latitudes and better integration with rescue agency response protocols. These improvements addressed some of the communication challenges that had complicated Bobby's emergency response, though the basic limitations of distance and weather in Arctic rescue operations remained unchanged. Research institutions tested various bear deterrent technologies, including acoustic devices, chemical deterrents, and barrier systems, but found limited effectiveness against polar bears in hunting mode. The testing reinforced understanding that prevention through awareness and avoidance represented more reliable safety strategies than confrontational deterrent methods. Emergency rescue equipment manufacturers developed specialized gear designed for polar bear attack responses, including improved trauma care supplies, rapid evacuation systems, and cold weather medical equipment. However, the rarity of survivable polar bear attacks limited the practical application of these improvements, and rescue professionals emphasized that prevention remained the primary safety strategy. Philosophical and cultural reflections. 10 years after the attack, Bobby's death remained a defining event in Nome's collective memory, influencing fishing practices, community relationships, and ongoing discussions about balancing human activities with wildlife conservation. The incident demonstrated both the fragility of human life in extreme environments and the resilience of communities that choose to pursue their livelihoods despite significant risks. Community discussions about Bobby's legacy often focused on the question of whether his death represented a tragic accident or an inevitable consequence of living and working in polar bear territory. Most community members concluded that Bobby's death resulted from a combination of circumstances that could not have been predicted or prevented, while acknowledging that his experience and preparation had delayed rather than prevented the ultimate outcome. Religious and spiritual leaders in Nome addressed the theological and philosophical questions raised by Bobby's death, including discussions about divine providence, human responsibility, and the moral obligations of communities toward members who faced occupational dangers. These discussions reflected the deep spiritual connections that many Arctic residents maintained with their harsh but life-sustaining environment. The incident contributed to ongoing conversations about the ethics of wildlife conservation in areas where human communities had established traditional subsistence practices over generations. Bobby's death highlighted the complex moral questions surrounding the protection of apex predators in shared environments and the responsibilities of society toward both wildlife conservation and human safety. Continuing impacts and lessons. The legacy of Bobby Allen's life and death continues to influence Arctic fishing communities, wildlife research, and emergency response protocols throughout the polar regions. His story represents the complex relationships between human survival, environmental adaptation, and the enduring power of communities to support each other through tragedy and loss. The incident remains a sobering reminder of the risks facing those who choose to make their living at the edge of the world, while also celebrating the courage and determination that enable human survival in Earth's most challenging environments. Educational institutions throughout Alaska incorporated Bobby's story into curricula addressing Arctic survival, wildlife biology, and community resilience. Students learned about the incident as part of broader lessons about human-environment interactions, risk management, and the importance of traditional knowledge in contemporary challenges. The educational applications ensured that Bobby's experience would continue to inform future generations of Arctic residents and researchers. Emergency management agencies throughout the Arctic regions continued to reference Bobby's case in developing and refining response protocols for wildlife attacks and wilderness emergencies. The incident provided valuable data about communication challenges, coordination requirements, and community support needs during traumatic events in remote locations. These ongoing applications ensured that lessons learned from Bobby's death would continue to benefit emergency responders and at-risk communities. As Nome continues to face the ongoing challenges of Arctic life, Bobby's memory serves as both warning and inspiration, reminding residents of the dangers they face while celebrating the qualities that enable them to thrive in one of the planet's most unforgiving environments. His death marked the end of one fisherman's long career, but also contributed to improved safety, increased awareness, and stronger community bonds that continue to benefit future generations of Arctic residents. The story of Robert Allen's final morning represents more than a tragic encounter with nature's apex predator. It embodies the ongoing human struggle to survive and prosper in environments that demand constant vigilance, courage, and community support. Bobby's legacy lives on in the improved safety protocols, enhanced research, and strengthened community ties that emerged from the tragedy of December 14, 2024, when the ice claimed one of its most experienced and respected guardians. In the years following Bobby's death, climate change continued to alter the Arctic environment, bringing new challenges and uncertainties to communities like Nome. Rising temperatures, changing ice patterns, and shifting wildlife populations created additional complexities for residents pursuing traditional livelihoods. Bobby's death served as a reminder that adaptation and vigilance would remain essential for survival in an environment that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. The polar bear that killed Bobby Allen continued to live and hunt in the waters near Nome, serving as a symbol of the ongoing coexistence between human communities and apex predators in shared Arctic territories. Wildlife researchers continued to monitor the bear's movements and behavior, contributing to growing understanding of polar bear adaptation to changing environmental conditions. The bear's survival represented both the success of conservation efforts and the continuing reality of risk for humans working in polar bear territory. As new generations of fishermen took up the nets and traditions that Bobby Allen had maintained for over 4 decades, they carried with them the knowledge, caution, and respect for the Arctic environment that his death had reinforced throughout the community. The ongoing commitment to fishing traditions, despite the risks demonstrated by Bobby's fate, testified to the resilience and determination that had enabled human survival in the Arctic for thousands of years. The final chapter of Bobby Allen's story continued to be written through the lives of those he had influenced, the safety improvements his death had prompted, and the ongoing commitment of Arctic communities to maintain their traditional relationships with one of Earth's most challenging environments. His memory served as a permanent reminder that courage, preparation, and community support, while essential for Arctic survival, could not eliminate all risks from a life lived at the edge of the world. The end. Author's note. This novel is based on the tragic real-life polar bear attack that claimed the life of Robert Allen near Nome, Alaska on December 14, 2024. While the basic facts of the incident have been preserved, many details, character backgrounds, and community responses have been developed through research and imagination to create a comprehensive narrative that honors both the victim's memory and the broader challenges facing Arctic communities. The story serves as both a tribute to those who risk their lives in pursuit of traditional livelihoods and a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance, preparation, and community support in Earth's most unforgiving environments.